A child was born where the galaxy no longer looked. No witnesses stood nearby. No records were made. Even the Force remained quiet. Stone walls surrounded him. Broken ones. Walls that once carried the banners of an empire already erased. This place had a name once. It had meaning once. But by the time the child arrived, it was only a ruin, a Sith enclave abandoned after defeat. The war was over. The Sith had lost. And history had decided nothing important would ever come from here again. The galaxy was wrong. He was born beneath cracked ceilings and burned symbols. The air smelled of ash and old metal. The ground was soaked with echoes of pain that never fully faded. No healer arrived. No midwife spoke words of comfort. Only silence answered his first breath. The Force stirred not in warning, but in recognition. This child did not scream for long. He learned early that sound brought nothing back. Silence became his first teacher. There were others in the ruins. Few, starving, broken by time and fear. They did not raise him with care. They survived him. Food was scarce. Warmth was rarer. Affection did not exist. Every lesson was simple. Endure or disappear. The ruins whispered to him while others slept. Old corridors carried voices without mouths. Fragments of Sith teachings lingered in the stone. Not words. Feelings. Hunger. Loss. Control. The child listened without understanding. But the dark side understood him. He did not play. He watched. Other children would have cried for comfort. He watched the shadows instead. They moved when nothing else did. By the age of 6, he had learned something dangerous. Pain could be shaped. When fear overwhelmed him, objects nearby would tremble. Loose stones shifted. Dust lifted from the floor. No one taught him how. No one stopped him either. The adults noticed too late. They feared him quietly, the way weak people always do. They avoided his gaze. They whispered when he slept, but even fear could not save them. Hunger came first. One by one, they faded. Some left the ruins, chasing rumors of food. Others never woke again. The child remained. Alone, he survived on what the enclave still provided. Old stores, stale rations, rainwater caught in broken stone, and the Force. It fed him when his body failed. It hardened him when weakness crept in. It taught him that survival was not mercy. Years passed unnoticed. No Jedi felt him. No Sith claimed him. The galaxy moved on without ever knowing his name. But the ruins remembered. They shaped him slowly, patiently. Without love, he learned from absence, from loss, from echoes of an empire that believed fear was order. By the time he left the Enclave, he was no longer a child. And when he vanished from those ruins, no one noticed. Not the Jedi, not the Sith, not history itself. Only the Force marked the moment. A presence slipped into the galaxy, quiet, unclaimed. The Emperor's ghost had taken its first step. He left the ruins when the wind changed. Not because he wanted to, because the voices stopped. For years, the Enclave had whispered. Now it was silent. He crossed a scorched valley with no map. He followed the sun until it vanished behind clouds. He did not know where he was going, only that he could not stay. His feet bled, his skin cracked, but the Force kept him upright. It pulled him forward, and it never once promised why. He wandered through broken outposts, places the war had left behind, places where scavengers picked bones clean. No one helped him. He looked too empty, too cold. Even when he begged, They stepped around him, but he watched. Always, he studied how people moved, how power worked, how hunger made men cruel, and fear made them obedient. He learned that kindness was rare, and most often, fake. So he stopped asking. In the shadows, he listened. He picked up broken data pads. He learned to fix old terminals, just enough to steal information. And when no one was looking, he trained, not in lightsaber forms, not in drills or kata. He trained his silence. He could move without making sound, disappear behind doors, slip into empty corridors, and listen for hours. The dark side followed him like a scent. It clung to his skin, even when he tried to ignore it. At night, he felt it breathing near his spine. It wasn't a voice. It was a feeling, instruction. He found an abandoned Sith shrine beneath an old mining site. Most walked past it without seeing. He walked inside. The air shifted, cold, heavy. He sat in the center and waited. Nothing happened. Not for hours, not for days. Then the shrine responded. It showed him memories, ghosts etched into stone. Not visions, not hallucinations, imprints of anger, murder, betrayal. He didn't flinch. He watched the story of a Sith Lord poisoning his own apprentice. He watched a child rip out her own eyes to escape her master's visions. He watched a brother and sister duel for 8 hours until only silence remained. And through it all, he felt nothing. Not horror, not pity, not fear, only understanding. Pain was the currency of truth. He stayed there for weeks, maybe months. Time faded. He read what he could, tore pages from half-burned tomes, etched words into the floor. One sentence stayed with him. Power is not taken, it is accepted. He didn't understand it. Not fully, but he kept it anyway. One day, mercenaries arrived. They thought the shrine held treasure. They found him instead. He didn't move. He didn't speak. They laughed. The first man approached, raised his blaster. He didn't fire. His lungs collapsed before he could. No lightsaber. No weapon. Just a whisper through the Force, like air sucked from a sealed room. The others ran. He didn't follow. He simply sat back down, as if the interruption had never occurred. The shrine was his now, not because he earned it, because it recognized him. He was no longer just a child. He was a vessel, empty enough to carry what others feared. And in the dark corners of the galaxy, rumors began to spread. A boy, no older than 15, sitting in a place that should have killed him. They called him a myth, a ghost. They didn't know his name. He didn't either. Not yet. But he was learning, and the dark side was learning him back. He never left the shrine. Not fully. Even when his body wandered, his mind remained buried beneath that stone. It had become his mirror, not for reflection, but for recognition. It showed him what he already was. The galaxy outside continued to burn. Petty wars, shifting empires, Sith rising, falling, devouring each other. He watched from the cracks, never interfering, always recording. He learned names before they mattered. Revan, Malak, Khan. He listened to holofeeds in old cantinas. He followed warbands from the edges of forests. He scavenged Sith armor from forgotten skirmishes. Not to wear, to study. He wanted to know why they all failed. He noticed the pattern. They rose from pain, but they never outran it. They killed masters. They betrayed apprentices. And then they repeated the cycle. He saw the flaw, not in the code, in the craving. Sith wanted to be remembered, and memory was a chain. So he chose a different path. He would not join the wars. He would not claim temples. He would not take a name. Not yet. He returned to the ruins where he was born. No one remained, just dust and bones. He walked through the chambers slowly, felt the silence settle into him again. This was where he first heard the dark side. It sounded different now, not like a whisper, like breath. It filled him, calm, unbroken. He reached the room where the others used to sleep. Their markings were still carved into the walls. He ran his fingers across the symbols. They meant nothing to anyone else, but to him they were memories of hunger, of cold, of silence. He buried the bones, not out of love, out of ritual. Even forgotten lives deserved endings. He burned what remained, not the ashes, the history. He erased all traces of them, even his own presence. There would be no trail, no legacy. He would not be found again. When he left the ruins this time, he did not look back. He wandered until he reached a city, one big enough to hide in. Nar Shaddaa, a place where names meant nothing, where credits spoke louder than blood. He lived in the underlayers, among spice runners, slicers, and slaves. He never begged. He offered services. He could fix broken tech, unlock doors without touching them, predict patrol patterns with unnatural precision. They called him the Shadow, not because he was deadly, but because no one remembered when he arrived. He was quiet, polite, distant, but when danger came near him, something always went wrong. Guns jammed, doors sealed. Enemies forgot why they were angry. The dark side walked with him, invisible, patient. He found old Sith recordings on the black market, corrupted holocrons, fragments of ancient speeches. He didn't need the full message. He heard the meaning in the pauses. He built a small chamber in the Undercity, sealed it with blood and focus. There, he meditated. For hours, days, sometimes longer. He didn't reach out with the Force. He let it find him, and it did. In visions, in breath, in memory, he saw the galaxy as it truly was. Sith pretended to be gods. Jedi pretended to be saviors. But both were terrified of silence. He was not. He didn't want to rule. He didn't want to be followed. He wanted to remain. Not alive, not dead, present. When he was ready, he gave himself a name. Not one from prophecy, not one from bloodlines. A name from absence. Mortis. It meant death. But not the kind that ends. The kind that waits. He disappeared the same way he lived, quietly, without witness, without sound. One night, the chamber beneath Nar Shaddaa was empty. No sign of struggle, no sign of life, just cold air, and the feeling that something had left. Not died, not escaped, just left. Those who remembered him said nothing, or pretended they never met him. He had become a myth in real time. Rumors surfaced in distant sectors. A masked figure walking alone on DXM. A cloaked man meditating for days on the edge of Korriban's cliffs. A stranger who spoke to no one, but made Sith Lords step aside. No holos, no recordings, only fear. He had no followers, no army, no banner, but whispers called him Darth Mortis. A Sith with no master, no history, no proof. The Jedi Order dismissed the stories. Too vague, too scattered. But some masters, the older ones, felt the cold before sleep. A ripple in the Force that didn't pass. They called it a shadow. Something waiting behind the veil. Even the Sith didn't know what to believe. Some thought he was a failed experiment. Others believed he was a weapon, designed and abandoned. But no one claimed him. No one wanted to. He didn't fit their stories. He didn't seek titles. Didn't crave war. He just watched. When Darth Nihilus consumed planets, Mortis said nothing. When the Brotherhood of Darkness fell, Mortis did not rise. When Bane rewrote the Sith under the rule of two, Mortis stood aside, because he understood something they didn't. The galaxy would destroy itself without his help. He didn't need to lead it there. He only needed to wait. And so, he drifted. From ruined temples, to crashed ships, to unmarked tombs where the Force screamed in its sleep. Each place fed him, not with knowledge, with presence. He wasn't learning anymore. He was remembering memories that didn't belong to him, but felt carved into his bones. He began to wonder if he had ever been born, or if the Enclave had simply exhaled him. Some nights he saw his own face in the dark, not reflected, projected. The mask always looked back. He had forged it in silence, forged it from nothing. It had no design, no language, just intent. It held in what might escape, his voice, his hunger, his memories. Because the longer he lived, the more dangerous remembering became. He didn't age. He didn't sleep like others. His body obeyed rules he no longer understood. Time passed around him, and inside him, something waited. There were still moments, brief ones, when he almost spoke, when he almost reached out, almost told someone what he was becoming. But no one ever stayed long enough. And the Force, it offered no comfort, only silence, just like the Enclave, just like the Shrine, just like him. So he embraced it. He vanished from all systems, all maps. Even the Force struggled to sense him now. He became weightless, formless, present only in absence. And in that stillness, he found peace. Not the kind Jedi speak of, not the illusion Sith chase. A different peace. The kind that exists when nothing is left to lose. The kind that lingers after memory fades. He was no longer searching, no longer becoming. He was. And somewhere in the forgotten layers of space, beneath the dust of lost wars and erased names, the galaxy breathed easier. Not because it was safe, but because it didn't know. He was still listening. Malachor was quiet when he arrived. Not dead. Not abandoned. Just quiet. The kind of silence that carries memory, not peace. The ruins didn't welcome him. They tolerated him. He walked between broken statues and shattered spires, past scars left by weapons that once tore through gods. The air was heavy. The ground pulsed beneath his steps, like the planet was still trying to forget what it had witnessed. But Mortis didn't forget. That's why he came. He didn't come looking for power. He didn't come to claim anything. He came to listen. The entrance to the lower tombs had collapsed, sealed by time, by fear. But the stone moved for him, not because of strength, because of silence. He descended alone, past burned ruins, past ancient wounds that still breathed darkness. And when he reached the end, he sat. He didn't ignite a light, didn't draw a blade. He waited. The tomb didn't speak at first. It watched. It studied the man who didn't demand answers, who didn't shout in rage or kneel in worship. He was still, and in that stillness, Malachor remembered. Whispers bled from the walls. Not language, not visions, feelings. The last screams of Jedi frozen in ash. The betrayal of apprentices who died too late to change sides. The sorrow of Sith who realized too late they were wrong. Mortis breathed it in, not with fear, with understanding. He didn't see Malachor as a battlefield. He saw it as a wound, still open, still bleeding. He made no camp, no shelter. The Force sheltered him. He didn't count days. There were no stars here, only the slow rhythm of dust. Scavengers came and went. They didn't see him. He was part of the stone now. Some said they saw a mask watching them from the shadows. Others refused to return. The tomb began to change. Walls that had stood untouched for centuries began to hum. Sith glyphs flared with brief, dying light. The Force was not responding to his commands. It was remembering him. Some nights the ground shook. Some nights the air wept. And still, Mortis remained. He wasn't meditating. He wasn't training. He was becoming. The galaxy had forgotten what Malachor was. But Malachor hadn't forgotten the Sith. The teachings buried here weren't about strength. They were about survival. How to become void. How to endure past death. How to exist without name or need. He traced the carvings with his hands. Let his breath match the hum of the ancient stone. Every echo showed him something. Not just about the Sith. About himself. He saw a man who no longer needed a purpose. Only presence. He saw a galaxy that no longer needed him. Only feared the idea that he might still exist. And beneath it all, he saw the truth the Jedi never touched. That power didn't shout. It waited. It watched. Like him, time drifted without shape. The wars continued above. Empires shifted. Orders fell. But down here, beneath layers of dust and memory, a single figure remained. Still masked, still silent. The tomb did not break him. Because there was nothing left to break. He was already gone. Only the Force remembered. And it did not speak in words, only silence. The deeper he went, the less the galaxy mattered. No calendars, no transmissions, no wars, only breath, only stone. The tomb didn't age. Neither did he. Time was a concept built by movement. Up there, stars moved, people ran, ships burned across the sky. But down here, nothing moved, and so time faded. He didn't speak. He didn't think in words. His mind became rhythm, stone, breath, force. The temple responded. It didn't open doors. It opened memory. The kind buried under layers of silence. The kind that wasn't his, but lived inside him anyway. He saw ancient Sith who came before names mattered. He saw what they sacrificed. Not just life, identity. They gave up the idea of self to become echoes. And the temple still carried their screams. He touched the walls. They vibrated beneath his fingers. Not violently, patiently, as if waiting for someone who wouldn't flinch. He flinched once, only once, when a voice not his own entered his thoughts. It wasn't instruction. It wasn't command. It was hunger, not for power, not for blood, for permanence. The tomb had been forgotten, but it remembered what it was built for. It wasn't made to honor the Sith. It was made to hold them. Prison, grave, mirror. He stood at the center chamber, where the old weapons still floated, frozen in time, not because of technology, because of trauma. The Force remembered what they did, and would not let them fall. He reached toward one, just once. The blade shivered, but did not move. It didn't fear him. It didn't respect him. It recognized him, not as heir, not as master, as equal. He lowered his hand, let it remain where it was. The Sith of old had left their weapons behind because they thought the temple would outlive them. They were right, but Mortis had no intention of leaving anything behind. No blade, no armor, no words, only presence. There were places in the tomb where light refused to exist, not because of darkness, because of memory. They were sites of betrayal, places where apprentices were tested and failed. He stood there for hours, listening. He didn't see visions. He didn't hear names. He felt the tension of choices, never spoken aloud. Fear, without voice. He breathed it in. Let it join him, not to conquer it, to become part of it. He wasn't building power. He was dissolving boundaries, between memory and mind, between presence and past. The more he gave to the tomb, the more it revealed. Not all at once, never as reward, only when silence was complete. He didn't pray. He didn't chant. He waited. He endured. The temple respected that. Others had come before. Scavengers, cultists, ambitious Sith, hoping to claim what was buried. They all screamed. Before the end, he didn't, because he wasn't looking for anything. And that's why the temple gave him everything. The true teachings, not written, not spoken, absorbed. They lived in the cracks, in the stale air, in the weight of breath held too long. He learned the art of remaining. Remaining when pain burned. Remaining when madness whispered. Remaining when memory begged to be forgotten. And above him, the galaxy turned. But here, inside a temple that didn't know time, a figure in a mask sat without moving, and the Force listened back. The Sith felt him before they named him. A pressure in the Force. Not sharp, not loud, just wrong. Dark Council records spoke of Malachor as finished, purged, collapsed, a wound sealed. But whispers moved through lesser circles. A presence below the stone. A watcher who did not rise. Assassins were sent first. Quiet ones. They never returned. Not killed. Just gone. No bodies. No signs of battle. Only empty corridors. And the sense that something had watched them fail. The Sith did not panic. They rarely did. They assumed arrogance. They always did. Some believed he was a failed acolyte. Others said a cultist, feeding on old echoes. No one believed he could endure Malachor, except those who had been there. One lord descended alone, old, scarred. He carried a blade carved before the rule of two, a relic meant to command respect. He never drew it. The tomb swallowed his confidence first, then his voice. He reached the lower chamber and saw the figure sitting still, not kneeling, not defiant, waiting. The Lord spoke his title. It echoed back, broken. Mortis did not answer. The Sith raised his hand, called on rage, on hunger. The Force hesitated. Not refused, hesitated. That pause was enough. The Lord fell without sound, not struck, not drained, simply ended. Later, The Dark Council debated the loss. Briefly. Then they erased the report. No investigation. No retaliation. Silence was easier. Because he did not behave like a Sith. He did not seek followers. He did not challenge authority. He did not claim knowledge. He remained, and that frightened them more than rebellion. Some called him heresy, a Sith without ambition. Others whispered a darker thought, that he was what remained after ambition burned out. A consequence, holocrons failed near Malachor. Visions blurred. Prophecies dissolved into static. The Force bent inward there, as if listening to something beneath it. The Sith began avoiding the system, officially for strategic reasons, unofficially because no one wanted to be remembered by him. He had become a story told in caution, a warning passed quietly between masters and apprentices, not a legend to inspire, a reminder that some paths did not lead upward, they led nowhere. Mortis felt the shift, the Sith pulling away, the fear settling. He did nothing, because he had never been waiting for them. He had been waiting for the galaxy to forget him completely. That was the test. That was the final silence. The Jedi never came. They sensed Malachor as poison, something to avoid, something sealed. They were right, but not for the reason they believed, because whatever remained there was no longer aligned to war. It did not seek balance or dominance. It sought continuity. Mortis remained beneath the stone, while empires rose and collapsed above. He did not count the years. The Force counted them for him. Each forgotten conflict fed the silence. Each erased name made him heavier. He was no longer a man in hiding. He was a space the galaxy refused to look into. A blind spot. And blind spots grow. The Sith forgot him on purpose. The Jedi forgot him by instinct. That left only the Force. And it did not forget. It circled him, tested him, pressed against his stillness. He did not respond. He did not resist. He endured. That endurance became his signature. And somewhere, deep in the unspoken layers of Sith memory, a truth settled. Some ghosts are dangerous because they scream. Others, because they never do. He began to feel it from below. The galaxy moving on. New Vors, new Sith, new names shouted like truth. They spoke of power, victory, legacies. He listened. Through the Force, he felt every rise as a repetition, every fall as routine. He didn't hate them. He didn't envy them. He pitied them. Each one louder than the last. Each one more desperate to be remembered. But history erases echoes that try too hard. He had become something else. Not a name, not a chapter, a constant. He remained while others burned out. He observed without interference, not because he feared them, because he had seen what waited past them. He didn't need to test them. The galaxy would do that. He only needed to watch. Sometimes, he felt them try to reach him, through old artifacts, through corrupted holocrons. They asked for secrets, for guidance, for shortcuts. He gave nothing, not because he couldn't, because they wouldn't understand. Truth spoken too early becomes noise. So he stayed silent. Let them call him myth. Let them say he died. Let them believe he never existed. It made things easier, even for him. But the watching never stopped. He felt Jedi temples rise again. Felt them built on hope, on structure, on fear disguised as balance. He felt young Sith rage without shape, burning for purpose they didn't understand. He watched both sides, search for meaning, in the middle of forgetting. He didn't judge, because he had stood there too, long ago, before he had a name, before he learned that silence was the only thing that survived the truth. There were moments, rare ones, where something flickered. Someone strong, someone uncertain. He watched them longer, not to interfere, to remember what he once was, and what he had avoided becoming. He wondered if that made him weaker or stronger. Then the feeling passed, because identity no longer mattered. Only presence, only stillness. He had no goal, no revenge to fulfill, no prophecy to complete. He had seen the end of those stories. They all ended the same. Alone, forgotten, replaced. But what cannot be replaced is what refuses to be written. That was his lesson. Not carved in stone, not spoken aloud. Lived. Every breath inside the temple had etched it deeper into him. And now, as he sat beneath the weight of all he had learned, he did not wonder when he would leave, because there was nowhere else to go. Everywhere else was noise. Only here, in the shadows of Malachor, was there clarity. He no longer needed the Force to move. It moved through him, not as servant, not as weapon, as mirror. And when the galaxy called for answers, for guidance, for power, he said nothing. He watched, because that was all it ever needed. A witness. And as stars collapsed above, as masters killed students, and students betrayed masters, Darth Mortis remained beneath it all, still masked, still waiting, not for them, not for war, for silence to return, for history to reset, for the moment the galaxy would finally forget everything it thought it knew. And in that moment, he would still be here, breathing, watching, alive, in the one place where memory cannot reach. He came to Ambria alone. No ship waited in orbit. No signal marked his descent. The planet had been abandoned long ago, left to bury its wounds beneath silence and sand. But the Force still remembered. It always does. Ambria was not just a place. It was a scar, one left by Sith sorcery so violent, the land itself refused to forget. He walked without direction. The wind carried ash across his path. It whispered things no one else could hear. It didn't guide him. It judged him. He passed skeletal trees, their roots twisted like broken limbs. The sky above was pale, starved of color. He didn't look up. He was listening. Deep beneath the surface, something stirred. It had been sleeping for centuries, but not peacefully. Legends spoke of a Jedi named Thon, who once sealed the dark side beneath Ambria's crust. But legends fade, and the seals weren't made to last forever. Mortis found the first crack by accident, a shift in the ground, a breeze too warm. He pressed his hand against the stone and felt it recoil. The darkness remembered him, not as an intruder, as kin. The well beneath Ambria was no ordinary place. It didn't contain darkness. It produced it. Mortis descended into the rift. Without fear, he did not bring light. The glow from the walls was enough. Not light, exactly. Something older, like memory that refused to die. The air thickened the deeper he went. Breathing became a choice. Pain became routine. At the bottom, he found the pool. Still, silent, endless. It was black, but not empty. It was not liquid. It was not gas. It was memory, turned to rot. He knelt at its edge, removed his mask. The darkness did not move. It watched. And for the first time in years, Mortis spoke, not in basic, not in words, in breath, in offering. He opened his palm and drew blood, not with a blade, with thought. The skin parted. The pool accepted the gift. Slowly, reluctantly. It did not hunger for blood. It hungered for permanence. Mortis stayed there for days, letting himself dissolve into the well's presence. Draining, then restoring, then draining again. It didn't teach. It consumed. Each breath became harder. Each heartbeat quieter. But he remained, because he understood. This was not a place of death. It was a place of forgetting. And that's what he needed. To remove the final tether. To make the Force stop recognizing him as human. He took more blood, poured it across the stones. Not randomly. He had seen these symbols before, half-burned, half-screamed, into the walls of the Malachor tomb. Runes designed to rewrite flesh, not protect it, unbind it. He carved them into his skin, one at a time, with fingers that shook but never stopped. Each cut was a sacrifice, not of pain, of memory. He forgot his homeworld first, then his voice, then the sound of his name. And with every loss, the well grew calmer, as if finally he belonged. He did not scream. There was no one to hear him, not even the Force. Only the well, only the dark. It whispered a promise. When the final symbol was drawn, "You will not die." He breathed in once, felt it settle into his lungs, felt it burrow. And in that moment, something ancient inside him closed. Not a door, a wound. He rose. Not healed, not broken, changed. The well did not release him. It followed, not as a voice, not as a presence, as a condition. When Mortis left Ambria, the planet did not resist. It had taken what it wanted, and given something back. He felt it in his steps, in the way his shadow lagged behind him, slightly out of time. The galaxy looked the same, but it no longer felt the same. Colors dulled, sounds thinned. Time slowed around him, then rushed ahead. Without asking, he traveled next to Onderon, not to its cities, not to its throne, to its forgotten outskirts. Villages erased from maps. After old Sith wars scarred the land, places where fear lived quietly. He did not arrive as a conqueror. He arrived as a shadow. The people sensed him. Before they saw him, children fell silent. Animals fled. The elders whispered old warnings. They did not fully remember. Mortis did not threaten them, did not speak. He stood in the center of the village and waited. The fire came first, not flame, Force. It poured from him, like breath released after holding it too long. The ground cracked, not violently, deliberately. Life recoiled. The villagers collapsed, not dead, not yet. Their life did not leave their bodies. It was pulled. Slowly, carefully, the well inside Mortis opened again. He felt it drink, not greedily, precisely. Each heartbeat stolen was folded into him, like another layer of skin. Some screamed, some prayed. He did neither, because this was not rage. This was ritual. He moved through the village, with measured steps, never rushed, never cruel, just exact. The fire followed him, invisible, but absolute. When it was over, nothing remained. No bodies, no ash, just emptiness. A clean wound. Mortis stood alone and felt the change settle deeper. His heartbeat slowed, then steadied. He waited. Minutes passed, then hours. Nothing failed, nothing faded. He did not weaken. That was when he understood. This was not a single act. It would never be enough. Immortality was not a gift. It was a hunger that never stopped asking. He repeated the ritual again and again, across forgotten settlements, across cursed valleys. Never cities, never armies, only places history had already abandoned. Each time, the fire returned faster. Each time, less blood was needed. The well had learned him, but something else began to happen. Between rituals, Mortis felt the spaces stretch. Moments skipped. He would stand beneath a sky and blink, and the sun would be gone. He would begin a thought and find it finished, without remembering the middle. Time was loosening, not breaking, unraveling. The well had kept its promise. He would not die, but it had taken something else instead. Urgency. Everything felt distant now, as if wrapped in layers of thick air. Pain dulled, fear thinned. Even memory softened at the edges. He realized then why the ancient Sith had failed. They tried to live forever, while holding on to who they were. Mortis did not make that mistake. He let the fire burn away. Everything unnecessary. Compassion, attachment, regret. Not because they hurt him, because they slowed him. The ritual reached its final stage, when the fire no longer needed blood, only presence. He stood alone on a barren plain, and let the force pass through him. It did not resist. It obeyed, and in that stillness, Mortis felt it clearly. He was no longer counting time. Time was passing through him instead. He didn't notice the pain at first. It came slowly, not as fire, as erosion, a feeling like fabric, pulled too tightly, over something that wasn't human anymore. His body began to resist itself. Not weaken, resist. The force inside him grew louder than his breath. His thoughts blurred beneath it. The runes carved into his flesh began to change. Some darkened, others faded. They weren't symbols anymore. They were sentences, instructions, warnings, written in a language only the dark side could hear. He stopped sleeping, stopped needing to. Dreams no longer visited him, not even visions. There was no next in his thoughts. Only now. The rituals had worked. He had made himself unkillable. But in doing so, he had severed his anchor to everything else. His voice, long unused, began to decay. Not physically, existentially. He could speak, but the words wouldn't matter. They wouldn't land. Even the Force had started to fear him. He felt it avoid him. Part like water around a rock. Not in hate, in preservation. He wandered again. Not to hunt, not to hide. To stay in motion. To keep what was left of his self from collapsing. Planets blurred together. The air never felt right. The stars never stayed in place. Time had become elastic. Some days stretched, some vanished. He would enter a temple and forget leaving. He would see the same star rise 3 times in different systems. The mask helped. It held in the parts of him that still remembered what a face felt like. Without it, his eyes burned. Not from light, from memory, trying to escape. His reflection vanished, not metaphorically. Mirrors rejected him. Water rippled when he approached. Even light bent. To avoid acknowledgement, he began to wonder if he was still a figure, or just a shape the Force hadn't let go of. Pain returned eventually, but it didn't come from the rituals. It came from awareness. He began to realize he could no longer feel the passing of life around him. Not emotionally, not through empathy. He knew when something died. He felt the shift, but it meant nothing. He could stand over a burning city and feel only wind. He tested it once, stood near a battlefield, in the outer rim, waited for the screams, the terror, the ripples. They came. He felt them, but not as sorrow, as weather, like rain, passing through leaves. It disturbed him, not because he had changed, because he couldn't remember when. That was the true cost. Not pain, not solitude, but the slow deletion of reference points. He had no joy, no grief, no hate, only function. He moved when needed, stopped when stillness returned. He didn't hunger, he didn't rest. A just continued. The price of immortality wasn't suffering, it was disconnection. He no longer knew what others feared, or loved, or hoped for. He saw people trying to survive, and couldn't remember why that mattered. He still remembered the Force, but not as something to serve, only as the wind between stars. He was no longer a Sith, not truly. He was what Sith left behind when their hearts gave out. A vessel, a scar, a witness. He still wore the mask, not to hide, to remind himself. He once had a face, but if it cracked now, he wasn't sure what would look back, and so he said nothing, did nothing, just continued. There came a day when he forgot what year it was, not because he didn't care, because the year no longer applied. Time had stopped shaping him. He was still breathing, still moving, but nothing changed. His body remained intact. No scars, no aging. The blood inside him no longer answered to rhythm. It flowed when it wanted to, paused when it didn't. He stood beneath 3 suns, on a planet no one named anymore, watched them set in the wrong direction. He waited. They rose again, out of order. The sky was broken, or he was. He didn't speak to anyone. There was no one left to speak to. Not because the galaxy was empty, because he had moved outside its notice. People passed him in markets. Pilgrims brushed past his robes in ancient temples. None of them remembered his face. Even as they looked straight at him, he was present, but not perceivable. The rituals had unhooked him from shared memory. He had no context, no place to belong, no title to be summoned by. Even his name began to feel like a myth. He overheard in another life. Mortis, he used to say it with purpose. Now it barely echoed in his mind. He walked through ancient battlefields, untouched by age, not as a traveler, as a shadow the war forgot to bury. He didn't count how many planets he crossed. He didn't track years. He only paused when silence felt right and waited until movement returned. The Force had changed its shape around him. It no longer spoke in visions or symbols. It simply accepted him, not as ally, not as servant, as constant. He had become a fixed point in a galaxy that refused to stop spinning, not guiding it, not pushing against it, just enduring it. He watched Jedi orders fall, one after another, watched Sith orders devour themselves, again and again, each one louder than the last, each one promising finality, each one forgotten. But he remained, not because of will, because of structure. He had built himself to withstand erasure, and now he could not undo it, even if he wanted to. There were moments, rare, still moments, when he almost did, when he saw a child laugh in the shadow of a ruined temple, or a dying soldier reach for someone he couldn't save. And something inside Mortis moved, not enough to speak, but enough to ache. Then it passed, always, and he returned to silence. His mask remained sealed, his robes unweathered, his eyes untouched by time. He stood in the heart of collapsed cities, wandered through libraries, when names had burned away. He saw what happened to those who chased forever, and what happened to those who feared it. And still, he chose neither. He chose presence, stillness, observation, existence, not as power, as fact. He became the pause between history's repetitions, the breath before the next fall. The Force knew him now. Not as user, not as enemy, as mirror. It looked into him and saw what happened when memory refused to fade. What happened when silence learned how to breathe. He was not waiting for death. He had already passed it, not once, but many times. Each ritual, each sacrifice, each fracture in his mind was a burial without a grave. And now there was no one left to remember what he once was. No legacy, no apprentice, no war, only endurance, only the long, unbroken line of a life without end. There was a time when he could remove the mask, not in battle, not in ritual, but in solitude. He would set it aside, run water over his skin, and remember that he was still human underneath. But that time passed, quietly, without warning. One night he reached for the clasp, and his hand didn't move. Not frozen, refusing. His body understood something. His mind hadn't yet. The mask could not come off, because now it wasn't armor. It was protection, not from others, from himself. He had looked into the Force too long, too deeply. He had broken the boundaries between memory and identity. And now, his face held things that were never meant to be seen. He caught a reflection once, not in glass, in the eyes of a dying Jedi. The man dropped his saber, tried to speak, tried to scream, then fell forward, without a mark. His heart had stopped. Mortis hadn't touched him, hadn't spoken. He had only turned his head. The Jedi's last memory had been a glimpse of something the Force couldn't explain. After that, Mortis stopped facing anyone directly. He moved with silence, kept his gaze low, avoided even moonlight. The mask became his breath, his sleep, his pulse. It held the storm inside. He did not fear what he had become, but he understood that others should. Because his face no longer showed identity, it showed consequence. The rituals had marked him, not with scars, with layers. Every time he pulled from the well, every time he took breath from another, his form absorbed the memory. Not just energy, not just power, memory, and it had nowhere to go. So it settled beneath his skin, pressed against his eyes, sank into the muscles around his mouth. He forgot the sound of his own voice, but not the faces he had taken. They waited in him, silent, unblinking. The mask kept them quiet. It wasn't designed. It wasn't forged by hands. It had grown, formed slowly over years of silence and endurance. Obsidian, cold, unbroken. It did not shine. It did not crack, because it wasn't meant to be removed. It was meant to be worn, until nothing remained underneath. There were moments when he wanted to feel wind again, to let the air touch his skin, to hear the world without an echo. But those were thoughts from another life, a life that ended the day he realized the Force no longer reached for him. It recoiled. He had not become invisible. He had become unbearable, a singularity in human form. The mask helped others believe he was still a man, that there might be a soul beneath it. But even he no longer knew for sure, and so he never took it off. Not in sleep, not in solitude, not in pain. He wore it through centuries, as a reminder and a seal, a barrier between the galaxy and the truth of what he had become. He wasn't hiding, he was containing, and in the stillness beneath forgotten stars, when no one could see him, he sometimes forgot he was wearing it at all. The mask had no name. It was not a relic, not a trophy, not even a weapon. It was a wall, carved from obsidian, too old to remember light, polished only by time, and shaped by nothing but necessity. He didn't wear it because he wanted to. He wore it because the Force asked him to. Because without it, there was no barrier between memory and motion, no shield between identity and absorption. Mortis had become a conduit, not of knowledge, not of pain, of accumulation. Every life he touched left an imprint. Faces, words, final thoughts. They didn't fade. They stayed, and they collected. In the quiet, he once tried to ignore it, tried to pretend the mask was still his choice. But each time he considered removing it, his body rebelled. Breath shortened, vision narrowed. Not from fear, from imbalance. The Force inside him no longer recognized freedom. It needed limits, edges, seals. The mask became all three. He reinforced it with silent rituals. No incantations, just breath and stillness. He walked through Force nexuses and remained unseen. Not because he was hiding, because the mask muted his signature. He moved through ancient temples, where Jedi once carved hope into stone. He stepped across their symbols and felt nothing stir. They didn't notice him. And that was the point. The mask was not for intimidation. It was for containment. It held in more than presence. It held in prophecy. Because what Mortis had become was not part of any design. He had removed himself from destiny, from causality, from lineage. And that absence had weight. The Force didn't understand it. It couldn't, because Mortis no longer existed in alignment with future or past. He simply was, and that was dangerous. To the Jedi, who feared imbalance. To the Sith, who feared anything they couldn't control. Even to the Force itself, which depends on patterns. To breathe, the mask stopped those patterns from unraveling. It became a buffer between Mortis and the truths he had learned. truths too old to speak, too large to contain in words. There were nights when he stood before reflective metal and tried to see himself. He couldn't. The mask offered no reflection. Its surface swallowed light, and the man beneath it had forgotten what expression felt like. No pain, no joy, no surprise, only stillness. He had become a vessel of saturation, not full, overflowing. He no longer knew if he could feel sorrow, or if the echoes of sorrow had simply settled into the lining of the mask. He still remembered what it felt like to be seen long ago, before the rituals, before the fire, but those memories were voices now, low, faint, drifting in and out between breaths, and the mask kept them from taking shape. That was the trade. Contain the self and survive. Let the self loose and fracture. He had chosen, and with that choice, the man called Mortis disappeared from the galaxy's story. Not dead, not erased, just contained. He hadn't spoken in decades, not because there was no one to hear him, because there was nothing left to say. Words were for connection, for explanation, for presence. But Mortis had no presence the galaxy could understand anymore. He once whispered in meditation, soft syllables, old Sith mantras, half forgotten, half reinvented. Even those stopped. The rituals had reshaped his mind, his breath, even his memory of what a voice felt like. And the Force, for all its depth, did not speak in language. Only silence. There were still sounds in him. He knew that. He could hum, could growl, could scream, but none of it would carry meaning. None of it would hold shape. He had lost cadence, the rhythm of syllables, the urgency behind them. Once, long ago, a Sith acolyte stumbled into his presence, terrified, injured, seeking help from the ghost. He had been warned never to approach. Mortis tried to speak. The sound left his throat, like metal scraping against stone. The acolyte collapsed, not from the sound itself, from what he felt behind it. The Force rippled, fractured, widened. The air turned cold. Mortis hadn't intended harm, but the voice had become too heavy. It carried more than words. It carried history. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was weight. After that, he stopped trying. He no longer needed to speak. And the Force no longer needed his permission to act. He learned to command, with presence alone. Step into a room, and sabers would lower. Stand near a battlefield, and the dying would quiet. He began to wonder if his voice had ever mattered, or if it had only delayed the stillness he now embodied. He remembered fragments, the way his name once sounded, the way pain once escaped as breath. But those were echoes now, not emotions, not expressions, just residue. There was a time he considered recording his thoughts, to leave behind some explanation for whoever might find his name in the ashes of old wars. But he couldn't, because the words wouldn't obey him. He would begin a sentence, then forget why it mattered. He would choose a thought and feel it rot in his mouth before it reached form. Silence had changed him, not as punishment, as evolution. He no longer processed the world in sounds or phrases. He felt it as motion, as rhythm. He could sense deceit in footsteps, sense lies in the way air shifted around lungs. He didn't need speech. He had surpassed it. But even so, he sometimes missed it. Not the voice itself, the intimacy, the illusion that someone else could understand. He missed the pause before a word, the weight of meaning carried on breath. He missed being able to say, "I was here." Now, his presence said it for him, but only to the Force, not to people, and the Force never answered back. Mortis still breathed, still moved, but his voice, his last anchor to identity, was gone, not broken, absorbed, and somewhere in the dark corners of himself, he knew that if he ever spoke again, the sound might unravel everything. They stopped looking for him. The Sith, the Jedi, even the shadows between them. Not because he had vanished, because they convinced themselves he never existed. The archives held no records. The temples spoke no warnings. Not even the Force whispered his name anymore. That was how he knew. The mask had done its work. It had separated him from history. He could stand on the surface of Korriban, beneath ancient tombs, and feel nothing stir. No ghosts, no resistance, just dust and the sound of forgetting. He walked through war zones before they began, watched armies assemble, watched orders form. No one noticed him, not even the seers. He didn't hide his presence. He simply no longer registered as someone real, because the galaxy had decided to move on. Mortis had lived long enough to see his own memory dissolve. He wasn't hated. He wasn't feared. He was ignored. And that was the final silence, the kind that doesn't come from victory or defeat, the kind that comes when no one remembers why you mattered. He returned to the ruins of Malachor once, centuries after he had last stood there. The temple had collapsed, buried under time and disinterest. He found his old chamber, half sunken into stone. No footprints, no candles, no life. But the air still remembered. It shifted when he stepped in, like breath held for too long. He didn't speak, didn't sit. He just stood in the place where the galaxy had once begun to forget him. The mask remained cold, unmoving, a reminder that he could not cry, even if he remembered how. There were no voices in his mind, no echoes of old rituals, just quiet. He turned away, and the stones let him leave without protest. He wandered from system to system, not searching, not hiding, just continuing. He saw new empires rise, heard new names shouted in defiance and worship. They came and went, like seasons. Mortis watched them all, never once removing the mask. Not to test them, not to challenge them, only to remain. Because that was his lesson. Not power, not immortality, endurance, the ability to still be there when no one else is. He stood beside graves whose names had long faded. He walked through cities that no map remembered, and everywhere he went, the people looked past him, as if he were a shadow, cast by something they couldn't face. He didn't resent them. He had done the same to himself, covered the face, sealed the voice, erased the man, so that the Force could no longer find fault in him. Only shape, only motion. He didn't know how many years had passed since he last heard his name spoken aloud. He wasn't sure he would recognize it. He wasn't sure he would answer. But still, he moved, because the mask never comes off. Because some choices aren't reversed, they are carried forever. He was not born into the Sith. He wasn't chosen, trained, or claimed. He emerged. No ceremony, no title, no master to call his own. And that's why they feared him. The Sith believed in power, but they also believed in chains, lineage, hierarchy, tradition twisted into doctrine. The rule of two had become gospel. A master, an apprentice, no more. But Mortis belonged to none of it. He operated outside the structure, outside the code, outside the fear that kept weaker Sith loyal. He didn't challenge the rule. He didn't even acknowledge it. Because he understood something they didn't. That rules don't apply to things the Force can't define. The Dark Council took notice. At first, he was a whisper, a myth tied to ruins, a shadow beneath forgotten systems, a figure seen, then forgotten. But then he started appearing in places that mattered. War zones, sanctuaries, tombs no one else could enter. He left no destruction, no claim, no message, only silence, and that silence spread. Artifacts went missing. Sith Lords turned paranoid. One member of the council, Darth Arid, spoke his name during a briefing. The temperature in the room dropped. The lights dimmed. No one laughed. The Sith were not superstitious. They didn't believe in ghosts, but they did believe in anomalies. And Mortis was one. No known lineage, no documented training, no confirmed kills. But he was felt. In the Force, in visions, in the places. The Sith had stopped watching. They tried to find records. Nothing. No origin planet. No clan. No sponsorship from the academies. He hadn't come through Korriban. Hadn't earned any rite of passage. He had never submitted to a master. He had never been punished. That made him dangerous. Because the Sith taught obedience through pain, and Mortis no longer recognized pain as anything but weather. He was something else. Not above the Sith. Not beneath them. Beside them. A parallel path. The code never accounted for. He never recruited. Never taught. Never built a following. He simply appeared where the Force bent too far. And when it bent, he was there to watch it break. Rumors said he fed on dead nexuses, that he entered collapsed tombs and made them colder. Gitter. Some believed he wasn't even alive, that he was an echo, left behind by a Sith, who died wrong. But the Force knew better. Mortis was not a spirit. He was not a memory. He was real. And that made him worse. Because spirits can be ignored. Stories can be dismissed. But a man with no allegiance and no limit, that's a threat. The Sith were never trained to face. They debated how to label him. A rogue? A failed experiment? A pretender? But none of those names fit. Because he didn't want power. He didn't want followers. He didn't want anything. He just kept moving. And the Sith began to understand. Something they never said aloud. He was not playing the game. And that made him unpredictable. The Dark Council ruled through fear. Fear of power. Fear of betrayal. Fear of being replaced. It was the fear that made them predictable. Efficient. Dangerous. But Mortis didn't fear them. He didn't challenge their authority. Didn't speak against them. Didn't even acknowledge them. And that was the problem. The Council could punish dissent. They could crush rebellion. They could eliminate rivals. But Mortis offered them nothing to hold. No titles. No army. No need. Just presence. He moved like a ghost, but left no trail of death. No public executions. No declaration of strength. He didn't rule planets. Didn't court influence. He walked alone, and wherever he went, the Force bent. Just slightly. Just enough for them to notice. Council meetings grew more tense. Visions became harder to interpret. Prophecies blurred at the edges. Some began to suspect that Mortis was interfering. Not with weapons, not with words, with silence. It unsettled them. Because the Sith believed that everything must be controlled. And silence, true silence, cannot be. Darth Vowron was the first to act, not because he hated Mortis, because he hated uncertainty. He ordered quiet observation. No declarations, no threats, just eyes in the dark. They found Mortis on Yavin 4, alone, standing before a half-collapsed Sith monument. No one had touched in centuries. He wasn't meditating. He wasn't performing any ritual. He was just there, still, present. The observers stayed hidden. They waited for movement. They waited for days. He never sat, never slept, never spoke, and when they finally approached, Mortis was gone. No footprints, no ship, no trace. The council received the report and said nothing, because silence was what they feared most. They began arguing more often. Paranoia rose like smoke. If Mortis had no allegiance, then who did he serve? If he wasn't loyal to the Sith, why hadn't he joined the Jedi? And if he wasn't with either side, what was he waiting for? One council member suggested recruitment. Another demanded extermination. But both options required contact, and no one could find him twice. He moved through time, as if it didn't apply to him. Centuries-old records would mention him once, then never again. A shadow beside an empire's fall. A shape seen before a temple cracked. Never confirmed. Never challenged. And slowly, the council began to shift. Not in action. In tone. They stopped asking where he was. They started asking who had seen him. Then they stopped asking altogether. A silent decision was made. Do not speak his name. Do not pursue him. Do not draw his attention. Because something in their bones, the part of them still connected to instinct, understood a terrible truth. Mortis wasn't hiding. He was observing. And if they forced him to act, he wouldn't attack their bodies. He would erase their meaning. And the Sith feared irrelevance. More than death, they ruled through fear. But Mortis ruled through absence. The order was never written, never spoken aloud. It passed between eyes, between silences, between pauses in conversation. Darth Vowron wanted Mortis gone, not because he was a threat to power, because he was a threat to understanding. So he sent assassins. Not just any, he sent the best. Sith, trained in shadow, raised without names, taught to kill without trace. They weren't designed to ask questions, only to end them. They found Mortis on Dromund cars, or what was left of him. He was standing in the rain, beneath a dead tree, watching the storm pass over the old Sith Academy. He didn't move, didn't look up. They circled him. 7. Each from a different master, each desperate to prove themselves. They had studied his movements, or what little there were. They had brought tools, prepared for every kind of defense, except the one they found: stillness. Mortis didn't resist, didn't ignite a blade, didn't posture. He turned his head slightly, and the force changed shape. It wasn't a wave, not a blast. It was gravity. The weight of silence dropped. One assassin collapsed. No wounds, just gone, as if the memory of his life had been severed. Another drew her blade, but forgot why. Her eyes turned inward, and she screamed without sound. The others panicked. They tried to flee, tried to remember their orders. But memory slipped like water through fingers. Time bent. Rain stopped falling. The ground stopped existing. And Mortis just stood there, mask unmoving, watching. He didn't lash out. He didn't kill them. He let the force peel them apart. Not physically, existentially. When the storm ended, nothing remained. No bodies, no blades, no noise, just air that didn't feel quite right anymore. Vowron waited for the report. It never came. He waited longer. Still nothing. He sent another operative. Not to kill Mortis, just to confirm. They reached the site, scanned every meter, found no trace of battle. Only a dead tree that wouldn't rot, and footprints that ended too suddenly. The operative returned, empty, taken, and the council stopped asking. They never admitted what happened, never investigated, but the message spread quietly through the ranks. Don't approach the masked figure. Don't speak his name. Don't look too long. Some said Mortis had turned the assassins to dust. Others claimed he had taken them into himself. One Sith theorized that he had unspoken mastery of Mekuderu and dissolved them through invisible machines. But those were guesses, all guesses. The truth was simpler. The Force had erased them in his presence. Not because Mortis wanted it, because Mortis allowed it. And that was worse, because if he had done it in anger, they could prepare. If he had done it in fear, they could exploit him. But he had done it without emotion, without change, without noise, and silence, when it kills, leaves no wounds. The decision was made without ceremony. No vote, no argument, just a quiet understanding, shared between Sith, who suddenly felt small. Darth Mortis would not be hunted. He would not be challenged. He would not be acknowledged, because to acknowledge him was to admit failure. The Dark Council did what it had always done. When faced with something it could not control, it erased. Records were altered, mentions removed, holocrons sealed and buried deeper than before, names scratched from stone, dates blurred, witnesses reassigned or silenced. Mortis became a gap, a missing line, in an otherwise perfect lie. Apprentices were warned in private. Masters spoke only in implication. There was no title, no official decree, just a rule that was never written. Do not name him, because names carry power, and the Sith had learned that power worked both ways. Mortis felt it when it happened, not as pain, not as loss, as lightness, a pressure lifting from the edges of his awareness. The force around him loosened, stopped circling. He was no longer being watched. Not by the Sith, not by history. That was what he had always been moving toward. Absence. He didn't celebrate, didn't react. He simply continued. The galaxy began to forget him in layers. First, the stories faded. Then the warnings. Soon, even the fear lost its shape. New Sith rose, who had never heard his name. They studied old texts and never noticed what was missing. They repeated mistakes that had already been punished once. Mortis watched. He did not intervene, because intervention creates memory, and memory was what he had escaped. He passed through academies, where students trained for power. None sensed him. He walked through Sith libraries, where knowledge rotted on shelves. None reacted. He stood beside Dark Lords, who proclaimed themselves eternal. They never felt him watching, and slowly, the galaxy closed over the space he left behind. Like water over a stone that sinks too quietly, Mortis no longer needed the mask to remain unseen. He had become unseen, not cloaked, not hidden, unrecognized. There were moments, rare ones, when someone almost noticed, a flicker of unease, a pause in speech, but it never lasted. The Force smoothed it away, because the Force, too, had accepted the decree. Mortis was not part of balance, not part of conflict. He was a remainder, a consequence that no longer needed a name. And that was the final truth. The Sith never understood. Power seeks dominance. Immortality seeks continuation. But absence endure. Mortis had not defeated them. He had outlived their relevance. And now, with his name removed from history, there was nothing left to pursue, no prophecy to fulfill, no enemy to face, just a figure moving through time, without friction, without resistance, without memory. The Sith, who should not exist, no longer did. Not on record, not in doctrine, only in the quiet places, where the Force still hesitated. And even there, it said nothing. He should have killed her. Everything about that moment said so. The war was raging. The ruins beneath their feet still smoldered from the last orbital strike. The Force between them crackled with tension. And yet, he didn't move. Darth Mortis had slain Jedi before. Dozens, maybe hundreds. He didn't keep count. He didn't care to. But this time, with his blade raised and hers lowered, something inside him paused. She was younger than he expected. Her armor was dented, her hair damp from the storm. There was blood on her lip, but she stood without fear. Her name would come to him later, Ceres Vale. But in that moment, she was just a stranger who didn't run. Most Jedi flinched when death approached. They begged or they fought with desperation in their eyes. She did neither. She simply looked at him, not with pity, not with judgment, just stillness. It unnerved him. The silence between them grew heavy. The rain hissed against his lightsaber. Her hands remained at her sides. She wasn't surrendering, and she wasn't challenging him either. There was no fear in her stance, only acceptance. It wasn't bravery. It was something else. Recognition. He had no memory of lowering his blade, only the sudden weight of not using it. She didn't smile. She didn't thank him. She simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the broken temple behind her. And Mortis let her. That moment should have meant nothing. But for reasons he could not name, it stayed. The next time they crossed paths, it was on Ossus. Mortis was hunting an old holocron buried beneath a collapsed library. She was already there, sitting quietly beside the ruin, her presence cloaked in the Force. She did not interfere. She didn't even speak. He took the holocron. She watched him go. He remembered the sound of her breath. Years passed, then decades. Wars came and went. Empires fell. Orders were shattered. But somehow, their paths kept overlapping. Never in violence, never in peace, just presence. Her robes would flicker through a crowd. Her Force signature would appear on an abandoned world he thought forgotten. She would leave first, or he would. And still, no words were spoken. The Sith taught that attachment was weakness. Mortis had believed that. He still believed it. But what grew between him and Ceres Vale wasn't love. It wasn't even affection. It was quieter than that. Smaller, like a single ember that refused to die. He found her once in the wreckage of a crashed freighter, her lightsaber drawn, her leg injured. She didn't ask for help. He didn't offer it. He killed the scavengers and left without a word. She didn't flinch when he appeared, and he didn't look back when he walked away. By then, the galaxy had forgotten her. The Jedi were scattered, hunted, and purged. She had no place, no temple, no council. She was a ghost of a forgotten order. And he was a wound the Force refused to close. And yet, the connection remained. He never sought her out, but he never avoided her either. There was no story here, no tragic romance, no great betrayal, no alliance, no betrayal. Nothing that would be recorded in galactic archives. Only a blade that didn't strike. And the silence that followed. They were never on the same side. Even when the galaxy shifted, even when alliances cracked and empires reformed, Mortis and Ceres Vale remained who they were: Sith and Jedi. Their codes could never meet. Their paths were always meant to end in violence, but they didn't. What grew between them didn't belong to war. It belonged to the space between it. There were years when Mortis didn't sense her. The galaxy became loud again, filled with new Sith, new enemies, new betrayals. He descended deeper into the forgotten halls of the dark side. Worlds burned under his command. Temples fell to his silence. He wandered systems untouched by navicomputers, searching for truths lost even to the ancients. But the memory of her, it stayed. Then came Arcanum. Mortis was hunting something buried beneath the tombs, a presence older than the Sith, sealed behind doors carved with forgotten glyphs. He moved through the shadows alone, and still he felt her. Not close, not near, but watching. She had followed him again. She never tried to stop him. She never attempted to turn him. That wasn't her way. Her silence was her rebellion, not against him, but against the war itself. In her stillness, she resisted everything the galaxy tried to force upon her. They stood once under the stars of Malachor V. It was a cursed place, long abandoned. Mortis walked through the rubble of a Sith shrine, his mind focused on the echoes in the Force. When he turned, she was there. No weapon, no words, just presence. They stood like statues for what felt like hours. Then, without a sound, she vanished again. Others tried to name it, to label what passed between them. But they misunderstood. There was no romance, no forbidden attachment, no fragile alliance. What Mortis and Ceres shared was older, deeper, something no holocron would record. It was respect born in silence. It was a connection that asked for nothing. In a galaxy where everything screamed for power, for vengeance, for control, their stillness was its own kind of rebellion. Years passed, the war grew colder, the Jedi faded into myth once more, and Mortis, unchanged, continued walking the path of shadows. He no longer served the Dark Council. He no longer answered to doctrine. He became what the Sith feared most, a power unchained, with no one left to contain him. And yet, in all that freedom, he still remembered her. Once, he found a collapsed archive on Dantooine. It had once been hers. She had etched her name in the stone, long before he ever knew it. It was faint now, worn by wind and age, but he felt her there. The way a scent lingers after a flame dies. He didn't touch it. He simply stood there, letting the Force carry whatever remained of her presence into the hollows of his armor. There were no answers, no resolution, no final moment between them. The galaxy kept spinning. The war kept changing faces. The names of Sith and Jedi rose and fell like tides, but the war between them never came. Because they had already chosen not to fight, not to speak, only to remain. He never told anyone. She never did either. What they shared was not meant for others to understand. It was not part of the war. It existed in the moments between it, a quiet resistance to everything they were taught to become. And in that silence, they found something neither had a name for. He felt it before it happened. Not as pain, not as fear, as absence. The Force did not cry out. It did not scream or ripple the way it did when planets burned or Sith fell. It simply thinned, like a breath released and never taken again. Mortis stopped where he stood. The galaxy was loud around him. Ships passed overhead. A storm gathered beyond the horizon. But inside him, something went quiet in a way he had not felt since the rituals on Ambria. He knew her name then, Cirrus Vale. He did not ask how he knew. The Force did not explain. It never did with things that mattered. She died far from him, on a world that would never be remembered. There was no great battle, no last stand sung by survivors. Only a broken skirmish at the edge of a forgotten sector where the Jedi no longer sent reinforcements and the Sith no longer bothered to finish the job. She was already tired. She had been tired for years. Her blade failed before her will did. Her body failed before her faith did. And when the final moment came, there was no one left to witness it. No council to mourn her. No order to record her sacrifice. Just the Force. And him. Mortis did not move for a long time. He stood still as the feeling settled, heavier than anything he had carried in centuries. This was not grief. Grief had shape. This was something quieter, a realization without words. She was gone. Not finished. Not hidden. Gone. He did not rage, did not tighten his grip on the Force, did not look for the ones responsible. That instinct had burned out of him long ago. Instead, something unfamiliar happened. He remembered, not events, not moments, presence, the way she stood without fear, the way she watched without judgment, the way she never asked him to change, and never tried to stop him from being what he was. She had seen him when the galaxy chose not to, and now she could not see him anymore. That truth struck deeper than any blade. He walked for days without direction. Systems blurred. Hyperspace passed unnoticed. He did not know where he was going until he arrived. Rain fell when he stepped out of the shadows. The ruins were smaller than he remembered. Time had collapsed the stone. Moss clung to the broken walls. This was where they first stood across from each other, blade and silence suspended between them. This was where he had chosen not to kill her. Mortis stood where she had fallen decades later, long after he had gone. The ground was clean now. No blood, no mark. History had erased her efficiently, but the rain remembered. It soaked his robes, ran down the mask he could never remove, dripped into the cracks where her body had once rested. He did not kneel. He did not speak. He stood. For hours. For longer. The rain fell harder. Wind rose. Still, he did not move. He let the silence do what it needed to do. There was no promise made, no vow of revenge, no whispered farewell, because what passed between them had never needed words. And now, Even in death, she remained consistent. She left him without asking anything in return. When the storm ended, Mortis turned away. He did not look back, but something had changed. Not in his path, not in his purpose. In the weight he carried forward. Sereth's veil was gone. But for the first time in centuries, Mortis knew what it meant to lose something that was never his. And that knowledge stayed with him. He came back when there was no longer a reason to. The war had moved on. Empires rose and fell. The Dark Council changed faces. Entire systems vanished from maps. But Mortis returned to the place that had once been nameless. Not for closure. Not for ritual. He returned because something in him had remained behind. The ruin was quiet. The moss had thickened. Trees had grown through shattered stone. No one had come here in decades. Not the Sith. Not the Jedi. Not even scavengers. Just him. The air still remembered, damp, cold, alive. He stepped into the center of the ruins, the same place where Sereth's veil once stood, where she had not raised her blade, where he had not struck. And though nothing remained of her, no marker, no ash, no bones, the Force still whispered in the silence. It did not speak her name, but it held her shape. He stood in that place again, this time without purpose. The mask did not come off, it never had, but his posture changed, not weak, not bowed, just still, as if the Force itself had slowed around him. The rain began. Soft at first, then steady, then heavier. It fell in sheets across the ruins, soaking every surface, carving new paths through old stone. The same way time carved him. The same way memory carved what little was left of who he used to be. Mortis did not move. He let the water run down the mask, drip from the edges of his robes, sink into the soil beneath his feet. Each drop was a reminder that something had passed through here once, something the galaxy did not notice, but he could not forget. Sereth had been one of the few who saw him, truly saw him. Not the title, not the fear, not the armor, just him. And now, she was nowhere. But in the rhythm of the rain, she was everywhere. He stood there until the light faded. Until the ruin turned to shadow, until the sound of the storm replaced every thought. It was not mourning. He did not mourn. It was remembering, not to change the past, not to make sense of it, just to feel it again, even if only through silence. When the storm quieted, Mortis finally moved. Not far, just enough to place his hand against the stone where she once leaned. The texture had changed, softer, wetter, but the shape was the same. He stayed there for minutes that felt like lifetimes. Then he turned, not with purpose, not with destination, but with understanding. Some things cannot be undone, some bonds cannot be named, and some ghosts do not fade, not because they linger, but because they were never truly gone. As he left the ruin, the rain slowed to a mist. No one would ever know he came back. No record would show it. No Sith archive would acknowledge it. But the Force would remember. And in that memory, Sereth's veil would remain. Not as a warrior, not as a Jedi, not even as the one he spared, but as the only thing in a long, dark life that had ever made him pause. He vanished into the mist without a sound. The ruin behind him stood empty, but not forgotten, because the rain would return, and it would remember everything. No one charted its location. No beacon lit its path. The shattered moon above Odessa Fastin held no name, no records, no breath of wind. It was a place the Force itself seemed to avoid, where the stars dimmed and sound didn't carry. Beneath its surface, carved into the bones of broken stone, was a tomb that no Sith dared speak of. They called it a fortress, but it was never meant for war. It was a vault, a cage, a retreat. Mortis had built it by hand, not with laborers or slaves, but through the precision of the Force itself. Stone by stone, chamber by chamber, he sculpted silence into the walls, darkness into the corridors. There were no banners, no statues, no throne, just layers of passageways, each one descending deeper into solitude. He chose this moon for a reason. It was broken, like him. The destruction above mirrored the erosion within. Centuries had passed since Mortis had walked freely among Sith lords or Jedi hunters. The war had changed. The galaxy had changed. But Mortis hadn't. He was still the same shadow, unaligned, unwanted, unkillable. And so he disappeared into the cracks of space, where the Force whispered only to itself. The entrance to his tomb could only be felt, not seen. It was cloaked in an ancient ritual, designed to blind both machines and minds. Even if a ship passed overhead, it would register nothing. No mass, no warmth, just static, where a moon should be. Only those who had touched true darkness could ever sense it, and even they would not go looking. Because Mortis wasn't dead, he was waiting. Inside, he kept no lights. His vision was shaped through the Force alone. The corridors bent like veins, pulsing with echoes from past lives. Sith spirits who had once ruled empires now whispered through the stones, not summoned, not enslaved, but listened to. Mortis didn't seek command. He sought understanding. He was building a council of the forgotten. At the heart of the tomb was a single circular chamber, sealed in obsidian. This was where he placed the relics, things the Jedi believed had been destroyed and the Sith hoped had been lost. Fragments of holocrons from the 100-year darkness, war masks worn by ancient exiles, the blade of a Sith king who had drowned an entire city. They weren't trophies, they were reminders. Each object held voices, and those voices spoke to him. Some nights, Mortis would sit for hours in total stillness, not meditating, not sleeping, but listening. The Force in this place didn't flow like it did on Coruscant or Drummond Kaz. It was thicker, slower, like it had sunk beneath the ground. Every breath inside the tomb felt like breathing through memory. Time didn't pass here. It pooled. There were no clocks, no calendars. He had stopped tracking years long ago. Outside, wars were rising and falling. The rule of two had fractured the Sith beyond recognition. Jedi councils were collapsing under their own weight. But inside the tomb, Mortis remained, untouched, undisturbed, and yet not unchanged. He told himself it was study, that he had withdrawn to deepen his knowledge, to understand the ancient roots of power. But even he couldn't deny what the silence was doing to him. His voice had grown hoarse from lack of use, his gait slower, not from age, but from stillness. The obsidian mask he once wore only in battle now never left his face. The tomb was becoming him, or he was becoming it. Outside, legends of Mortis faded into myth. He had no apprentices, no armies, no traceable actions. Only rumors that he had vanished into a place where death would forget him. But the truth was stranger. Mortis wasn't hiding. He was dissolving. Not in body, but in memory. The tomb had no locks. It didn't need them. What Mortis kept buried wasn't protected by doors or walls. It was protected by fear, the kind of fear that couldn't be explained, only felt. Every relic sealed in that fortress radiated something the Jedi had spent generations trying to erase. And Mortis collected them not out of greed, but out of need. There was one holocron that never opened. Not for him, not for anyone. It belonged to a Sith who lived long before the Republic had language for darkness. Its sides were jagged, not smooth. Its core pulsed with a red that was neither light nor heat, just hunger. Mortis didn't ask it questions, he simply kept it near. Some nights he felt it whispering, not in words, but in emotion. Regret, fury, loneliness. That was the real reason he kept it, not for power, for recognition. These relics were his mirrors. Each one came from a forgotten corner of the galaxy. A dagger forged in a prison moon where Sith were left to rot. A crystal scorched in the fires of Malachor before the Jedi dared speak the planet's name. Even broken robes burned and blackened from a Dark Lord whose name was erased from both Sith and Jedi archives. Mortis gathered them like lost pieces of himself. Not for the galaxy, for memory. Because the galaxy had a habit of forgetting. It forgot the Jedi who questioned the code. It forgot the Sith who refused cruelty. It forgot those who walked between both, not because they were weak, but because they saw too much. Mortis never claimed to be wise, but he remembered, and the tomb was his way of refusing to let the past be buried in convenience. There were no labels, no history hollows, no lights to highlight artifacts. Just shadows and silence and stillness. Mortis didn't want to teach, he wanted to preserve. Because something inside him knew even the darkest truths deserved to be remembered. Not glorified, not justified, just acknowledged. But memory is not a passive thing. The deeper he went into the tomb, the heavier the air became. Not from rot or dust, but from memory pressing down. He began hearing footsteps that weren't his, whispers that didn't match any voice he knew. Some of them screamed, some wept. Others simply repeated the same word, a name, over and over, though he never understood whose. He never called it madness. He believed the Force had begun reacting to the tomb. Or perhaps the tomb had bent the Force around it. This place was no longer a structure. It was an echo chamber of forgotten truths, amplifying voices long silenced by war, betrayal, or doctrine. And Mortis had become its only audience. There was one chamber he rarely entered. It was round, hollow, and carved with runes too ancient for translation. At its center was a small stone basin filled not with blood, but with memory. When he stared into it, he didn't see himself. He saw visions, some from the past, others unclear. Sometimes a child weeping in a Jedi temple, sometimes a Sith kneeling beside a grave, sometimes just silence. He never told anyone what he saw, not because he feared it, but because there was no one left to tell. Years passed. Or maybe they didn't. Mortis stopped tracking time long ago. He became part of the tomb. He no longer slept. He simply was. Breathing with the stone. Listening to voices only he could hear. And among the relics, he began to forget his own. Not his name. That had long been irrelevant. But his reason. They spoke to him when the silence grew too deep. Not aloud. Not as ghosts rising from stone. As pressure. As thought that was not his own. Mortis never summoned them. He never performed rituals of binding or domination. He did not believe in enslaving what had already suffered. The dead came because the tomb allowed them to. Because it remembered them. At first, they were fragments, half-formed impressions drifting through the Force. A blade raised in betrayal. A scream cut short. A name spoken too late. Mortis listened without reaction. He had learned long ago that resistance only sharpened the voices. So he let them pass through him. Over time, they began to settle. The presence of ancient Sith lords gathered in the deeper chambers, not as individuals, but as echoes shaped by will. Lords who had ruled worlds, who had broken orders, who had died believing themselves eternal. Their ambitions had rotted away, leaving behind only intention. They did not ask to be remembered. They asked to be understood. Mortis would sit in the central chamber, motionless as the force thickened around him. In that stillness, questions formed without sound. Why did you fail? Why did you fall? Why did you believe power would save you from yourselves? The answers were never direct. They came as emotion, as regret, as exhaustion. One presence carried the weight of conquest. Another radiated endless hunger. A third whispered of love twisted into cruelty. Mortis did not judge them. Judgment required distance, and he no longer felt separate from anything in the tomb. He debated them in silence, not to correct them, not to learn from them, but to test the truth of their beliefs against the stillness he had become. They spoke of domination. He answered with endurance. They spoke of legacy. He answered with erasure. They spoke of immortality. He answered with stagnation. And slowly the voices changed. Not quieter, different. Some began to fracture, unable to reconcile their convictions with the state Mortis embodied. Others withdrew, sinking back into the stone, unwilling to confront what remained when ambition burned away. A few stayed. Those were the ones that troubled him most. They did not argue. They did not boast. They watched, as if studying what came after them. Mortis wondered if this was how he would one day sound. Not a voice, a pressure, a question without language. He felt the tomb respond to those moments. The walls pulsed faintly, the relics vibrated in sympathy. The force coiled inward, folding time until the chamber felt both ancient and immediate. Sometimes Mortis forgot which thoughts were his. He would consider a path, a memory, a choice, then realize it did not belong to him. It belonged to something older, pressing gently against his awareness, offering perspective rather than command. That frightened him, not because he feared losing control, because he feared there was nothing left to lose. The more he communed with the dead, the less solid his own identity felt. His name mattered less. His past thinned. Even the memory of Ceres Vale began to blur at the edges, softened by the weight of centuries pressing down. He fought that, not with anger, with attention. Whenever her memory surfaced, he held it apart from the others, kept it clean, untouched by the voices, a single thread of clarity in a web of ancient noise. But it grew harder. The tomb did not distinguish between memories. It preserved everything equally, and Mortis was becoming part of that preservation. He was no longer just listening to the dead. He was joining them, still breathing, still moving, but increasingly indistinct. A living echo in a place built to forget nothing. And somewhere beneath the shattered moon, the conversations continued slower now, heavier, pulling him deeper into a future where even silence would not remember which voice had been his. The temple never had a name. It was not carved into maps or spoken of in records. It was simply there, a buried structure of obsidian veins and crimson stone, twisted by ancient force rituals, hidden beneath the surface of a shattered moon. Time did not pass inside it. The galaxy could scream and burn above, but Mortis would not hear it. He had made this place to forget the stars. In the outer chamber, statues lined the hall, not of Sith lords, but of things older, shapes barely humanoid, beings whose names were lost even to the Sith. They watched him silently as he walked, like sentinels made of fossilized memory. He never bowed to them. He had not come for worship. He had come for silence. For weeks, Mortis would not speak. He moved as if dreaming, pacing between relics he himself had recovered from forgotten wars. Sith scrolls written in blood, holocrons that pulsed with whispers. A lightsaber that still burned blue, a Jedi's blade that refused to die. Each one had a voice. Each one reminded him of something he was trying not to be. There were no windows in the tomb, no clocks, no concept of day. Mortis abandoned his armor and cloak and sat for hours in meditation that offered no peace. The Force answered, but it answered in fragments, broken screams from dead worlds, shadows of Sith who were long gone, and worst of all, echoes of himself. He began to see versions of himself walking the halls. Not illusions, not ghosts, just memories that wouldn't fade. A younger version, laughing with fellow acolytes on Korriban. Another, covered in blood after his first kill. And the last, the current, him silent, tired, and unrecognizable. He wasn't just remembering. He was unraveling. One night, if night could exist here, he stood before an obsidian mirror in the sanctum's heart. He removed his mask, knowing no one was watching. And for the first time in decades, he looked at his own face. Pale, hollow. The skin had forgotten sunlight. The eyes, they weren't Sith. They weren't Jedi. They were empty. He did not cry, but he lowered the mask slowly and did not put it back on. The tomb began to change. Cracks appeared in walls that had once been unbreakable. Statues shifted positions when he wasn't looking. His relics no longer stayed where he left them. And the voices, once distant and weak, grew louder. One repeated his name over and over. Another asked why he stayed. And one whispered, "You're not real anymore." He tried to fight it. He lit his lightsaber and struck the walls, the artifacts, the voices. But nothing bled. Nothing screamed. And when he stopped, his blade dimmed, and the silence returned stronger than before. The decay was not physical. It was identity. Mortis the Sith, the warrior. The force of death was rotting, not in flesh, but in memory. There was no one left alive who remembered his victories. No apprentice to carry his legacy. Not even enemies who feared his return. The galaxy had moved on and left him behind. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. There was no reason to do either. The Force sustained him now, or maybe just habit. He wandered the halls like a ghost, forgetting which path led where. Some days he didn't even recognize the tomb as his. He whispered names of Sith lords past, hoping one would answer. They never did. And then, one day, Mortis stood at the exit of the tomb, the sealed threshold he had not touched in years. He stared at the stone, unsure why he had come. His hand lifted slowly and paused. He did not open it, because outside, the galaxy had forgotten him. And inside, he had forgotten himself. It started in silence. Not the kind that comes from emptiness, but the kind that follows something terrible. The cloning facility on Kamino hadn't seen activity in years, not officially. But in the shadows beneath the rain, something moved. Hidden corridors lit only by cold, flickering lights still pulsed with life. There were whispers, not voices, but echoes, residual memories left behind by what had once lived there. The storm never stopped. It hadn't for decades. Lightning curled across the clouds above, and deep below, a vat flickered to life. Designation, M0. Subject classification, irregular. Genetic base, classified. It was never about creating a perfect soldier. This one was different. It wasn't made to serve. It was made to remember. He didn't wake like the others. There was no shock of breath, no flinch from the cold. His eyes opened slowly, not with confusion but recognition. He knew pain, he knew loss, and though his mind had never seen war, his soul trembled with the weight of countless battlefields. Something had been passed into him not by design, but by mistake. A shadow that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. He saw flashes, a red blade humming in the dark, a woman standing in the rain, a temple buried beneath the bones of a moon. None of it made sense, not yet, but it felt real. Realer than the steel around him, realer than the technicians observing him behind reinforced glass. They ran tests, scans, neural diagnostics. The readings never matched their models. Emotion centers overstimulated, memory pathways misaligned, cortical echoes where there should have been blank slates. He wasn't reacting like a clone, he was remembering like a man. They debated terminating the project, but someone unseen, unnamed, overruled them. "Observe him," the voice said. "Let him unfold." So they watched, and he watched them back. He didn't speak, but when he closed his eyes, he could feel her again. The Jedi. He didn't know her name, but her face burned into him like a scar. She wasn't a vision. She was a wound, a silent ache echoing across time. The clone didn't understand what love was, but he understood loss. He kept to himself, watched the lightning, traced the patterns in the rain through the glass. He would sit still for hours, his eyes unmoving, yet deep within, things were shifting. Training programs meant to teach him obedience began to fail. Reflex tests returned unpredictable results. One day, he hesitated before killing a simulation. Not because of mercy, but because the target reminded him of someone. The scientists noticed. They tried to recondition him, increase the shock therapy. But each time they did, something inside him grew more resistant. A spark small, quiet, but alive. And then, one night, he dreamt, not like a clone, like a ghost. He walked through ruins lit by crimson skies. He saw temples burning, planets screaming. He saw Mortis not in form, but in feeling. The rage, the betrayal, the silence after. He didn't know who Mortis was, but he felt him. Every corner of that dream was soaked in the same grief. He awoke without panic, only purpose. And in that moment, he made a decision. Not to escape, not yet, but to remember everything. To become the echo. The visions did not come all at once. They arrived in fragments, quiet, uninvited. M0 would be standing in his cell, watching rain crawl down the glass, when suddenly the world would slip, not fade. Slip. The floor beneath his feet would feel wrong. Too familiar. Too old. He would see stone instead of steel. Cold corridors carved deep beneath a shattered moon. Obsidian walls humming with pressure. A mask resting on a pedestal, untouched for centuries. These were not dreams. They carried weight, texture, memory. Clones were not meant to see things like this. Their minds were engineered to be clean, empty, obedient. But M0's thoughts were crowded, filled with places he had never been and losses he had never lived. When the technicians scanned his neural activity, the readings spiked in patterns they could not classify. He remembered grief. Not personal grief. Something older, heavier, like mourning that had outlived its owner. Sometimes the visions came with sound. A lightsaber igniting, then shutting off without a strike. Rain hitting stone. A single breath held too long. Other times there were faces. Sith lords frozen in judgment, Jedi standing without fear, and always, beneath it all, the same silence. The silence Mortis had carried. M0 did not know that name yet, but the presence was unmistakable. It sat in his thoughts like an unmoving shadow, not guiding him, not commanding him, just watching. During training simulations, the visions grew stronger. When blaster fire filled the room, he saw battlefields that had ended centuries ago. When instructors barked orders, he heard Sith voices arguing in tombs with no light. When he closed his eyes, he stood before relics the galaxy had erased. He began to fail tests on purpose. Not because he wanted freedom, because he wanted time. Time to understand what was happening inside him. The scientists noticed the pattern. His obedience scores dropped. His reaction time slowed, but not from weakness, from hesitation. As if he were weighing outcomes he should not have been able to predict. One technician whispered that the clone was contaminated. Another suggested memory bleed from an unknown donor. None of them considered the truth. That Mortis had not been copied. He had been remembered. The first full vision came during a power outage. Lightning struck the towers above, plunging the lower levels into darkness. In that moment, M0 collapsed to his knees. Not in pain, in recognition. He was standing in a vast chamber of stone. Holocrons floated around him, humming softly. Sith lords long dead surrounded him, not as figures, but as pressure. They were arguing, debating something without words. At the center stood Mortis. Not speaking, not moving, just present. The clone felt the weight of centuries press against his chest. He felt isolation stretched so long it became identity. He felt love remembered only because it had been lost. And beneath all of it, a single truth surfaced. Mortis had tried to disappear. He had buried himself, erased his name, removed his presence from history. But memory did not obey erasure. It found cracks, it survived in fragments. And now, it lived in him. M0 opened his eyes in the cloning facility, gasping for breath he did not need. His hands trembled, not with fear, with clarity. He understood something the Empire never would. He was not just a clone. He was a continuation, a vessel carrying what Mortis could no longer hold alone. The visions did not stop after that. They sharpened, and with every memory that surfaced, M0 moved closer to a choice the galaxy was not ready for. They didn't know he was awake. The alarms were for something else, a weather breach, a system glitch. Storms raged across Camino often, but this one cut deeper. Lightning struck harder. Something had shifted in the air. Something had noticed him. M0 didn't plan the escape. He wasn't capable of planning. Not like that. Clones followed instructions, patterns, simulations. But when the facility lights turned red, when the guards moved without purpose, when panic leaked into the hallways, he just moved. Not with fear, with memory. He turned left before they arrived, slipped through a security hatch that should have been sealed, entered tunnels only senior technicians knew about. It wasn't instinct, it was certainty. Like someone had already walked this path and left the echoes behind. The cloning labs were on lockdown, every door sealed, every passage guarded. But the systems malfunctioned. Cameras went black. Doors blinked open, one after another, as if something was helping him. Something older than the Empire. Something watching from below. M0 crossed the lower platforms like a ghost. Security drones flew past him without reacting. Clones in neighboring cells stared in silence, unsure if he was real. One whispered a word, not his name, not his designation. Just a feeling. Darkness. That word followed him. When the guards finally saw him, they didn't see a clone. They saw something familiar. One reached for his weapon, then hesitated. A fraction of a second, enough for M0 to disappear again. He didn't attack anyone, didn't hurt anyone. He didn't need to. The facility was collapsing on its own. Not physically, structurally, in purpose, in certainty. Everything the Empire thought was controlled wasn't. Everything they buried leaked, and the leak had taken form. Outside, the storm had become violent. Waves crashed against the domes, lightning danced across the sky. M0 stood at the edge of the platform and waited. For what? He didn't know. But something would come. It always did in his visions. And then it did. An old supply skiff, long decommissioned, blinked to life. Its systems flickered like it remembered how to breathe. The hatch opened without code. The engines warmed without key. And before anyone could stop him, the clone who shouldn't exist was gone. No tracking beacon, no pursuit. The storm covered his trail, or perhaps something else did. In the command tower, a Sith Inquisitor reviewed the footage, frame by frame. The escape was impossible. There was no plan, no assistance, no explanation, just one anomaly. The way he moved. Not like a soldier, not like a clone, like someone who had been there before. Someone retracing steps from another life. The Inquisitor narrowed his eyes. He had seen that presence before, not in person in holocrons. Ancient records buried deep in Imperial vaults. A Sith who vanished before the Clone Wars. A name whispered during the fall of Malachor. Mortis. The Inquisitor did not speak. He simply erased the footage, all of it, and then he left. Far from Camino, aboard the drifting skiff, M0 sat in silence. He didn't understand what he had done. He didn't know where he was going, but he felt something inside him settle. Not peace, not identity, just recognition. He was no longer inside the Empire. He was inside something else. A story that hadn't ended. A shadow that hadn't died. And now, it was moving again through him. He drifted through hyperspace, nameless and silent. The stars didn't speak, the Force didn't answer, but the voice inside him never stopped. It wasn't loud, it didn't command. It whispered like memories leaking through broken glass. They weren't his, but they belonged to him now. He saw visions that had no source, battles in ruined temples, a woman's dying breath beneath falling stones, a war that ended in shadows, not victory. Each time his eyes closed, he remembered, and each time he opened them, the galaxy felt smaller. The skiff had no coordinates, no destination, just one fixed route away, from the Empire, from the Vats, from who he was supposed to be. M0 didn't know his name, but the galaxy would. He landed on moons where the air tasted of rust, walked through the ruins of forgotten Sith worlds, always following something that guided his hands, not his mind. He wasn't searching, he was returning. On Korriban, ancient tombs recognized him. Dust shifted under his boots like it had been waiting. Statues crumbled, not from age, from reverence. They bowed. In one chamber, he found a broken mask. He didn't touch it, but it shook. The Force around it trembled, not with power, with memory, as if the man it once belonged to was near. But M0 wasn't that man. He wasn't even real. Still, the flame inside him grew. He didn't build a lightsaber. He assembled it by accident, piece by piece, guided by something older than logic. It burned crimson when he held it, but not bright, not violent. It pulsed, like a heartbeat. The Empire noticed. An agent found the skiff wrecked on a forgotten moon. Traces of cloning fluid inside. Scans showed abnormal development patterns, and on the walls of the ruin marks etched in blood. Symbols of Mortis. The Inquisitors were deployed, but by then, it was too late. Min-Zero had already lit the flame. He wasn't recruiting, he wasn't hiding. He was moving across sectors, through broken stations, abandoned outposts. Wherever the Empire had left scars, he passed through them. And they followed him. Not soldiers, not Sith. Others like him. Clones. Some broken, some failed, some buried and forgotten. They didn't call him leader. They didn't call him anything. But when he stood, they listened. He never gave speeches. He barely spoke. But he remembered, and they could feel it, the pain that wasn't his, but somehow belonged to all of them. He didn't know what to build, so he built nothing. He didn't know what to destroy, so he destroyed nothing. But wherever he walked, things changed. Statues cracked, lights dimmed. The Force shivered not from power but recognition. Mortis was not alive. Mortis was echoing, through veins, through voices, through clones who remembered things they never lived. M0 didn't seek revenge. He didn't crave war. But the galaxy mistook silence for threat, and so they hunted him. Each Inquisitor sent after him returned different. The few who survived spoke in riddles, described visions of a Sith who wasn't there, standing behind the clone, speaking through him. They said he wasn't the threat. He was the door, a passage for something older, something unfinished. The Emperor dismissed it. He didn't believe in ghosts, but the Force did, and in time, it remembered. Min-Zero was no longer a clone. He was a message, written in flesh, carried through fire, and wherever he walked, the legacy of Mortis burned again. They said it was an accident. That was the story passed through Sith archives and whispered by those who survived the night. A ritual miscalculated, a hunger uncontrolled, a dark lord consumed by the very power he sought to master. But the truth was quieter and far more deliberate. The ritual took place on Drummond Cars, deep beneath the old citadel where storms never stopped beating against stone. Lightning clawed the sky as it always had. But that night the Force pressed downward, heavy and watchful. Mortis had chosen the chamber carefully, ancient, shielded, forgotten even by the Dark Council. He was alone. There were no acolytes to witness it, no apprentices to record it, no masters to intervene. Mortis had learned long ago that transformation required isolation. Witnesses turned change into theater, and this was not meant to be seen. The circle was carved into black stone. Old Sith runes etched so deeply they felt more like wounds than symbols. They did not glow. They drank light. At the center, Mortis stood unmoving, mask sealed, breath slow. This was not a ritual for immortality. That mistake would be made later by lesser Sith. This was a ritual of separation. Mortis had felt it for years, the pressure of memory building inside him, the weight of voices that never slept. The clone had escaped. The echo had begun to move without him, and the Force had shifted in response. Something was coming, not death, not rebirth, a thinning. Mortis did not ignite his blade. He did not chant. He simply opened himself. The Force rushed in. Not violently, relentlessly. It poured through the cracks he had spent centuries creating, through the absence he had cultivated, through the places where identity had already eroded. The chamber trembled, not from power, but from imbalance. For the first time in centuries, Mortis felt pain. Not physical pain, recognition. The ritual was working too well. The boundary between Mortis and the Force began to dissolve, not merge, dissolve. He felt time stretch thin around him. Moments folded into one another. Memories surfaced without sequence. Ceres Vale standing in the rain. The tomb beneath the shattered moon. The clone opening his eyes for the first time. The Force did not resist him. That was the danger. It accepted him. And acceptance meant loss of shape. The runes cracked. Stones screamed. Lightning struck the citadel above, sending fractures through the ancient foundations. Sith sensors spiked across the capital. The Dark Council felt it all at once, a pressure like a presence leaving reality. They would later call it failure. They would say Mortis was consumed. But Mortis did not scream. He did not fight. At the height of the ritual, he made a choice. He stopped holding himself together, not in surrender, in release. The Force rushed through the void he left behind, filling it with itself. His body collapsed as the last anchor slipped free, mask striking stone, breath halting. To observers who arrived later, it would look like death. A corpse, a shattered chamber, residual energy too unstable to approach. They would say Mortis had finally destroyed himself. But death requires an ending, and Mortis did not end. As his heart stilled, awareness did not fade. It widened. The ritual had not failed. It had done exactly what he intended. Mortis did not deandroman Kas. He stepped sideways, out of time, out of flesh, and into something the Sith had no language for. He waited in silence. Not on Dromund Kaz. Not anywhere. There was no floor beneath him, no sky above. No time to measure, no breath to count. The Force had swallowed him whole. And in that endless drift, Mortis began to listen. It was not peaceful. There is no peace in the void between life and the Force, only clarity. He saw himself reflected not as a man, but as a wound, a shadow cut from war, betrayal, exile. Every memory floated near, unmoored and speaking at once, faces blurred together, words repeated out of order. The scream of Ceres, the voice of the clone, the mask that never smiled. Mortis didn't try to hold on to anything. He let it all pass through him. Because he wasn't dreaming, he was dissolving. And yet, something stayed. A thread, a center, a shape that should not have remained but did. In the emptiness, Mortis realized the ritual had not erased him. It had thinned him, spread him. He was not gone. He was everywhere the Force could feel him. And that meant he could still watch, still remember, still wait. It wasn't immortality. It wasn't resurrection. It was worse. Existence without gravity, identity without weight. He saw the galaxy blink onward. Years passed like seconds. Sith rose and fell. Empires broke and reformed. The Jedi tried to rebuild, then fell again. Mortis watched them all from the edge of reality, unseen, unheard, but never fully absent. He should have gone mad. But madness requires a mind still shaped like a man. And Mortis had left that behind. The Force did not push him away. It adapted. It gave him places to hide shadows within memories, echoes inside rituals. Some thought they heard him in Sith temples. Others felt him in the walls of ancient tombs. Whispers, some called them. Nightmares. A chill during meditation. But it wasn't fear. It was Mortis remembering. There were moments he nearly surfaced, when dark side nexuses flared too brightly, When clones like M0 brushed too close to the truth, when someone uttered his name not in hatred but in reverence. In those moments, the veil thinned, and Mortis almost returned. But the Force never let him fully cross back. Because Mortis had not been banished, he had been preserved. A wound kept open, not to heal but to study. And so, he lingered, not as a ghost, but as a scar. One the galaxy had forgotten how it got. He saw Camino drown beneath the storms. He saw Korriban's sand cover broken temples. He saw the clone, the one with his face, walk into exile, lost and remembering dreams that weren't his. And Mortis began to understand. The ritual had worked because the Force allowed it. Because the Force was waiting too. Not for him, for the one who would need him. The clone, not a son, not a copy, a vessel. And Mortis, the real Mortis, had become something else. Not a voice, not a will, a current, a pressure, a presence that could pass through stone and skin and memory without ever taking shape again. Unless called, unless invited, unless someone wanted him badly enough to open the veil from the other side. And as that thought passed through the space where Mortis now lingered, he didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply remained. Because the galaxy was not done with him yet. And neither was the Force. The clone did not speak of him. Not at first. He drifted from world to world with no name, no rank, no purpose. Just a face one carved from someone else's war. On Eriadu, he worked the docks. On Nar Shaddaa, he vanished into shadow. No one asked questions. No one saw him bleed. But every night, when the stars came out, he closed his eyes, and Mortis was there. Not in words. In impressions. Visions. Dreams that weren't dreams, old pain trapped inside new flesh. The clone didn't know why he remembered the tomb on Dromund Kaas, why he felt the sting of lightning in his bones, why rage could rise in him like a storm with no sky. He didn't ask for it. He didn't want it. But memory doesn't need permission. It just survives. He thought maybe he was broken, that the Kaminoans had made a mistake, that his mind had fused with something else during the cloning process. But it was deeper than that. He wasn't corrupted. He was haunted, and the ghost he carried was not separate from him. It was becoming him. Elsewhere, the galaxy shifted. The Sith began to splinter again. Jedi searched for peace among ruins. The old wars were no longer spoken of. The name Mortis was not erased. It was simply buried, too obscure for the new Sith to honor, too dangerous for the Jedi to study. He became a myth without memory. But myths don't die. They wait for someone to believe in them again. And the clone, he believed, not with words, not with loyalty, with fear, with confusion, with the slow, inevitable realization that he was not alone inside his own mind. He had inherited more than flesh. He had inherited presence. So he ran. To Yavin the Four, to Deeksun, to Vijun. Each time trying to bury the feeling in different soil. But Mortis was never tied to one place. He was in the clone now, folded into the way he moved, the way he thought, the way he saw violence before it happened. And the clone stopped resisting. He started remembering. There were moments he would whisper names he'd never heard before: Ceres, Atrin, Vathis, and he'd wake with tears in his eyes, not knowing why. He'd look in the mirror and see someone else watching back. Not always, but often enough that the reflection began to feel like a stranger. He wasn't sick. He was remembering a life that wasn't his. And it was changing him. The Force doesn't forget. It stores echoes, impressions, scars. And sometimes, when the wound is deep enough, it seeks a vessel to reopen the pain. The clone had been grown to be useful, but he had become something else entirely. A memory with a heartbeat, and the galaxy didn't notice. That was the tragedy. Mortis was returning piece by piece, breath by breath, and the galaxy went on pretending he was gone. The Republic focused on rebuilding. The Sith fought over shadows. Even the Force itself seemed indifferent. But Mortis didn't need an audience. He needed time, and time was all he had now. The clone crossed into the unknown regions. He found a world with no name, where the stars felt farther away. He sat in silence for days, weeks. He stopped eating, stopped moving. He just listened. And in that silence, something moved inside him. Not words, not commands, just recognition. He wasn't being watched. He was the watcher. And the galaxy had made a mistake. It thought Mortis had died. It thought the past was buried. It thought silence was the end. But silence was only the beginning. He no longer used a name. The clone had stopped calling himself anything at all. Not because he had no identity, but because too many were speaking inside him now. Memories layered over memories until even silence had weight. And when he closed his eyes, he wasn't alone. He saw the halls of Cast City, empty, echoing. He saw the altar, the blood, the broken mask. But he didn't remember these places because he lived them. He remembered them because someone else did. And that someone was still listening. Every breath he took now felt borrowed, like the Force was holding him in place not out of mercy, but out of design. There was something unfinished inside him. Not just a story, but a voice. And that voice was patient, cold, familiar. Mortis. The name was never spoken aloud, not even in his mind, but it lingered behind every thought. A presence shaped like rage, a hunger without a body. And slowly, without force, without violence, it began to merge with him. It wasn't possession. It was return. Across the galaxy, no one noticed. The Jedi had turned to other threats. The Sith had buried too many of their own secrets. Even those who had once stood near Mortis could no longer feel his trace. But he hadn't vanished. He had found a vessel. And now, he listened. He listened to the stars beyond the outer rim. He listened to the dying whispers of Sith spirits fading in ancient tombs. He listened to Jedi temples cracking under time. He listened to a galaxy that no longer remembered how to be afraid of him. And that made him smile. Because Mortis didn't want power anymore. He wanted understanding. The clone, or whatever he was now, began to write. Not in basic. Not in any known script. He etched symbols into stone with the edge of his fingernail. Marks that pulsed with Force resonance. They weren't words. They were memories, translated into pain. And each mark brought him closer. He didn't sleep, he didn't eat. He just existed between breath and memory, between thought and instinct. Sometimes he spoke in languages long dead. Sometimes he cried without knowing why. But always, always, he listened. To the Force, to the voices, to himself. And somewhere deep beneath that ruined world, where stars couldn't reach and time bent sideways, something began to stir. A ripple in the Force. Faint, but growing. Not loud, but steady. A resonance. As if the Force was finally listening back. He stood in the center of the ruins, arms by his sides, eyes closed. And then, for the first time, he whispered a name. Not his own. Mortis. And the air broke. It wasn't thunder, it wasn't wind. It was recognition, like the Force itself had flinched. Like reality had tried to forget that name. and failed. And in that moment, he knew he wasn't carrying Mortis. He was Mortis, rewritten, reassembled, returned, not as a Sith, not as a shadow, but as memory made flesh. The galaxy wouldn't see him coming, not because he would hide, but because it no longer believed in ghosts. It had turned its eyes to fleets, alliances, weapons, armies. But Mortis had no need for armies now. He was the war. And as he stepped forward, 1 foot in memory, 1 foot in the present, he did not speak, did not scream, did not announce his return. He just listened, and the Force listened with him. Because some deaths aren't real, some silences are temporary, and some names are only waiting to be heard again. There were no statues built in his image, no hymns whispered through the tombs of Korriban. No final resting place carved in stone, only silence, and in that silence, a mask, motionless, watching, waiting. For centuries, Darth Mortis vanished from the galaxy's memory like a name never spoken aloud. But masks remember, even when the galaxy forgets. He once walked among the Dark Council, but even they did not know his true face. Some believed he had no face, that he had sealed his flesh behind the iron visage not for protection but punishment. It was the one relic he never removed, not in war, not in solitude, not even in death. It was not just a mask, it was a vow. When he fell, if he truly did, there was no funeral, no pyre, no sabers held high in tribute. The Sith did not mourn him. The Jedi never confirmed his end. He simply disappeared, and yet, not entirely. For across the centuries that followed, there were rumors of a masked figure seen in the shadows of shattered temples, of a presence felt on ruined moons where no life had walked in ages. They called it a myth, a ghost story, but those who felt it knew better. Mortis had always walked outside the boundaries of Sith legacy. He never claimed titles, never raised armies. He did not seek to conquer. He only observed. He studied the Sith, as if preparing for something. And when that time came, he did not announce his return. He slipped beneath the surface of the Force, neither dead nor living. A hollow thing. Something forgotten by design. There were moments in Jedi meditation when silence would fall too deep, a stillness unnatural. Ancient masters would shudder, unsure why. It was as if something was listening back, watching through the Force itself. That stillness had a name once. It was whispered by the few archivists who dared remember. The Hollow Emperor. He had no throne, no empire, no doctrine, and yet some believed he rewrote Sith destiny more than any other. Not through power but absence. Mortis became a wound in the Force, a void where legacy unraveled. Even holocrons began to degrade in his presence. Records would erase themselves. Names would blur. Knowledge would decay. He was not destruction. He was deletion. They say even Darth Vitiate, at the height of his madness, refused to speak of Mortis, that he once ordered an entire archive vaporized because it contained a single line. The masked one listened still. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps Vitiate understood the truth. Mortis was not a rival. He was a mirror, a reminder of what the Sith were never meant to become. And so the galaxy moved on. New wars began. New empires rose. Darth Bane would rebuild from the ashes. Darth Krayt would inherit ruin. And all the while, Mortis remained unseen, but never gone. He was the space between all Sith legacies, the shadow beneath every doctrine, the pause between every scream. No holocron tells his story in full. No archive confirms his fate. But some fragments remain. A broken saber hilt found on Drummond Fells. A chamber beneath the Valley of Golg, sealed with no key. And deep within a forbidden vault on Ossus, one corrupted crystal still humming with a frequency that doesn't match any known Kyber resonance. They don't name it, but it sings of silence. In the end, Darth Mortis became something worse than a legend. He became untraceable. A Sith, not remembered for his power, but for his ability to vanish. Entire fleets have left more legacy than he did. Yet somehow, his name lingers in the Force, quieter than a whisper, louder than a scream. His mask remains, somewhere, and it is still watching. In the restricted levels of the Ossus archives, there is a corridor few Jedi dare enter, not because of traps or darkness, but because of silence. The kind that presses against the mind, soft at first, then suffocating. That corridor holds the sealed vault's records too dangerous to erase, too cursed to share. And deep within those vaults lies a single entry, without title or author. It simply begins. He did not die. He fell into the gaps between memory. The archivists who found it could not trace its origin. It had no metadata, no encryption signature. It was as if it had always been there. The Jedi High Council ordered it reviewed and then sealed again. But one night, too curious for his own safety, broke protocol. He read every word. The next morning, he walked into the meditation gardens, placed his lightsaber at the roots of an unmarked tree, and never spoke again. The council erased his name from the record, but the whispers continued. Across Coruscant, droids began to malfunction when brought near the archives. Files corrupted without cause. And in the dead hours of night, sentries reported strange behavior from the holocron's lights flickering inside, like something trying to escape. The Jedi called it a contamination, a Force echo. But those who had read the forbidden entry knew better. Mortis was not content with death. He had become a presence in the records themselves. Not a ghost, something quieter, something that waited to be remembered. And when someone got too close, he whispered back. The Sith feared these stories more than the Jedi did. On Ziost, old texts speak of a heretic who never rose yet was never struck down. They call him the One Without Echo. His actions could not be predicted. His choices left no ripple. Sith historians rewrote their own scrolls just to erase the possibility that Mortis had ever sat among the council. Even memory was too dangerous. On Korriban, deep within the tombs, there is one hallway that leads nowhere. Its bricks are older than the rest. Its air, colder. Sith acolytes say the hallway was once sealed behind solid stone, but that it reappeared without warning, centuries after Mortis vanished. No one who walks to its end hears anything, but all who return carry a look in their eyes as if something had looked back. Some Jedi masters proposed a theory that Mortis had embedded himself in the Force like a forgotten algorithm. Not a being, but a pattern. A design that the Force itself had tried to delete and failed. His silence spread not by sound, but by interruption. He was the glitch in every prophecy, the blind spot in every vision. And he was growing. When Grand Master Sattel Shan meditated on the Sith resurgence, she once broke focus mid-session and whispered, "He's listening." Her aides assumed she meant vitiate, but her final notes from that day mention no such name. Only a phrase circled again and again in her handwriting. Hollow, hollow, hollow. Even the droids began to change. On Tython, a knowledge-seeking model called R3S9 began self-generating questions it was never programmed to ask. What is beneath the mask? What cannot be archived? And finally, who listens when the Force is quiet? Its memory banks imploded an hour later. the data unrecoverable. Mortis had no need for armies, temples, or legacy. His victory was silence, a silence that made the Force hesitate. That made the Jedi forget how to speak his name. That made the Sith pretend he never was. But the archives remember. Even now, something stirs beneath them. A whisper without breath, a truth without voice. And somewhere, the mask watches still. There was never a coronation. No banners were raised. No Dark Lord knelt. No throne was claimed. And yet, the Sith spoke of one. In fragmented texts buried beneath Drummond cars, there is mention of a seat that was never occupied. A place of authority without ruler. A position that existed only because someone refused to take it. The hollow throne. It was not forged from stone or metal. It was forged from absence. Mortis could have ruled. The Dark Council knew it. Even the Emperor sensed it. He had power without hunger, influence without ambition. He understood the Sith better than they understood themselves. And that was why he never sat above them. Power demands attention. Mortis demanded nothing. The Sith believed domination was the final truth. Mortis saw it as the final weakness. Empires rot because they must be seen. Kings fall because they must be remembered. Mortis chose the opposite path. He left a throne empty. And in doing so, he destabilized everything. The Dark Council argued endlessly after his disappearance. Not over succession, but uncertainty. Who replaces someone who never ruled? Who challenges someone who never claimed power? His absence became a question no Sith could answer. Some attempted to fill the void. They failed. One lord declared himself the unseen emperor. He was assassinated within a week. Another attempted to bind Mortis's name to prophecy. His mind fractured during the ritual. The throne rejected them all, because it was never meant to be filled. The hollow throne existed only as contrast, a reminder that power did not need to dominate to control, that silence could command more fear than tyranny. The Sith began to fracture not because Mortis attacked them, but because he proved something terrifying. They were unnecessary. In secret, some Sith began to imitate him. They wore masks. They spoke less. They vanished from records. But they misunderstood the lesson. Mortis did not hide to gain mystery. He hid to remove himself from the equation entirely. And without him, the throne remained hollow. Jedi scholars felt it too. During deep meditations, masters sensed a gap in the Force, not a wound. A space where intent once existed. It unsettled them more than darkness ever had. Darkness could be confronted. Emptiness could not. One Jedi described it as standing before a chair you know was meant for someone but finding it empty forever. The throne was not on Dromund Kaas. Not on Korriban. Not anywhere physical. It existed in the Force. A focal point where choice had been refused. Mortis had seen the future paths of the Sith. Endless cycles of domination and collapse. Masters devouring apprentices. Empires rising only to rot from within. He understood that ruling would only continue the pattern. So he broke it. Not by rebellion, by absence. The Sith never recovered from that. Every emperor that followed ruled in Mortis's shadow, even if they never knew his name. Every throne carried the echo of the one that was never taken. Every claim of eternal rule felt fragile by comparison. Because somewhere, deep in the Force, there was proof that the greatest power was to refuse power entirely. Mortis never ruled the Sith. He exposed them, and the hollow throne remained. Unclaimed, unmovable, watching, not waiting for a ruler, waiting for silence to finish what power never could. There is no tomb, no grave, no pyre, no final battle. There is only silence. And the Force does not speak his name. It's said that when a Sith dies, the galaxy shivers. When a Jedi passes, the stars mourn. But when Mortis vanished, there was no echo, no tremor. The Force simply paused, as if it had been holding its breath. Then nothing. Some claimed he was consumed by his own power. Others whispered he walked beyond the veil, into a realm the Force itself could not reach. But the archives hold no confirmation, no record, not even a classified one. Just a phrase, buried deep in forbidden text. The Hollow Emperor. He was never crowned, never recorded, but remembered. Not in holocrons or scrolls, not in monuments or teachings, but in shadows, in the quiet places between stars where Jedi meditate and Sith plot. There is a stillness that cannot be explained. That stillness is him. Even now, when Force sensitives reach into the void, some describe a presence that watches but does not answer. Cold, patient, not malevolent, but detached. As though something once human had stepped away from identity and never returned. That is the true legacy of Mortis. Not power, not violence, not legacy. Absence, a shape that once stood between empire and ruin, and then willingly erased itself. No Sith, before or after, chose that path. No Jedi could understand it. Because both sides need meaning. They need cause. They need narrative. Mortis needed none. His story ends without closure. And perhaps that is why it never ends at all. Some say his mask still exists sealed in an urn, locked beneath stone, protected by Force wards no one dares touch. Others believe it was never real. That the mask was just the last piece of Mortis to vanish. Not a relic, a memory, and still, sometimes, in the dead of night, when hyperspace tunnels distort and the Force ripples strangely, a ship's sensors will flicker. A faint life form detected, just for a second, then gone. Some report whispers in the dark, a shape passing behind them with no source, no sound. Always silent, always unseen. Always watching. And when Jedi Masters wake from deep meditation with tears they cannot explain, they do not speak of him, but they know. Some truths are too large to say aloud, too heavy, too sacred. Mortis is not a name now. He is a question. What if power was never the answer? What if silence is stronger than legacy? What if the one who walked away was right? No one will ever know where he went. Not truly. He left no path to follow, no apprentice to inherit his will, no teaching to corrupt or preserve. Just silence. A silence that grew until it became part of the Force itself. And now, across the galaxy, in moments of stillness between wars, between empires, between breaths, he lingers. The Sith will rise again. The Jedi will rebuild. The wars will continue, as they always have. But somewhere in the dark, the mask still watches, and the throne still waits. Not to be filled, but to remind the galaxy of the one who never claimed it. Mortis didn't die. He became the silence that follows.